Washington state's forests stretch across 22 million acres of dense wilderness where cell signals vanish, ancient trees create permanent twilight, and hundreds of people have disappeared without a trace. What separates these 11 accounts from typical campfire stories is that every person made it out alive, but none of them go back. Some returned with evidence they can't explain. Others came back different, changed by something they encountered in those trees. By the time you reach the final story, you'll understand why seasoned park rangers refuse certain patrol routes and why logging crews abandon equipment rather than retrieve it after dark. These forests have been here for thousands of years, growing denser, darker, and deeper into the mountains. They were never meant to be safe. Welcome to Verified Fears. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we're diving into the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. If you make it through all 11 stories without looking over your shoulder, drop a comment and let us know which one disturbed you most. Now, let's head into the trees and discover what's been waiting there. I'd been hiking the Gifford Pinchot trails for 3 years, and I thought I knew these mountains. I'd done the popular routes, the moderate climbs, even some of the backcountry loops that required permits. But that October afternoon, when the storm rolled in faster than any weather app predicted, I found myself pushing through increasingly heavy rain on a trail I'd never taken before. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. My jacket was soaked through, my boots were slipping on mud-slicked roots, and the daylight was failing 2 hours earlier than it should have. That's when I saw it through the sheets of rain. A fire lookout tower perched on a rocky outcrop about 200 yards off the trail. I'd read about these towers, how most of them had been abandoned decades ago when the Forest Service switched to aircraft surveillance. Some were maintained by volunteer groups. Others were left to rot into the mountainside. This one looked operational enough from a distance, and I wasn't about to spend the night huddled under a tree in a thunderstorm. I pushed through the undergrowth toward it, branches whipping across my face, rain coming down so hard I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The tower loomed larger as I approached, a skeletal wooden structure rising about 40 feet into the darkening sky. The stairs looked solid, thank God, and I took them 2 at a time, my legs burning by the time I reached the cabin at the top. The door was unlocked. That should have been my first warning, but I was too cold and too wet to care. I shoved it open and stumbled inside, immediately grateful for the shelter. The cabin was small, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with windows on all sides and basic furnishings. A cot in one corner, a small table, a couple of chairs, some shelving with supplies. It smelled like old wood and mildew, but it was dry. I peeled off my soaking jacket and hung it on a nail by the door, then dug out my phone. No signal, of course. I had maybe 20% battery left and no way to charge it. The storm was getting worse, lightning flashing across the sky, thunder following seconds later. I wasn't going anywhere tonight. That's when I noticed the logbook on the table. It was one of those standard composition notebooks, the black and white marbled kind, and it was open to a page dated just 3 days earlier. I picked it up, more out of boredom than curiosity. Fire lookouts kept logs of their observations, weather patterns, potential fire risks. I figured I'd read through it, maybe learn something about the area. The handwriting on the recent entries was neat, precise, the kind of penmanship you don't see much anymore. The entries were normal at first. Weather observations. A note about a family of black bears spotted near the western ridge. Cloud formations, wind speed estimates, standard stuff. Then I flipped back a few pages, and the tone started to change. The entries were still dated, still structured like official observations, but there were additional notes in the margins. Small things at first. Heard something circling the tower base around 2 a.m., probably an elk. Then, 2 days later, same sound, closer. Lasted about an hour. Couldn't see anything with the spotlight. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. I kept reading. The entries became more frequent, sometimes multiple per day. It's back, 3rd night in a row. Definitely not an elk. Movement is wrong. Then, counted the footsteps. It circles exactly 9 times, then stops at the base of the stairs for several minutes before leaving. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. The handwriting started to deteriorate, becoming more frantic, more cramped. Can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it on the stairs. But when I look, nothing's there. Another entry. Radio is dead. Hasn't worked for 3 days. Emergency beacon isn't transmitting. Tried to hike out this morning, but the trail is gone. I mean, completely gone, like it never existed. Just solid forest where the path should be. I looked up from the notebook, suddenly very aware of the darkness pressing against the windows. The storm was still raging, rain hammering the roof, but I could barely hear it over the pounding of my heart. I forced myself to keep reading. The entries were dated chronologically, each one more disturbing than the last. It knows I'm watching. When I shine the light down, I can see it move behind the trees, but it's always just out of the beam. It's learning my patterns. Then, found scratches on the door this morning. 4 parallel marks, deep gouges in the wood. They weren't there yesterday. I check the door every morning. I got up and walked to the door, running my hand over the wood. There they were. 4 deep scratches, right at eye level. Fresh enough that I could see pale wood beneath the weathered exterior. The next entry made my blood run cold. It climbed the stairs last night. I heard every single footstep, slow and deliberate. Counted them. Exactly 42 steps, which is correct for this tower. It stopped outside the door. I could hear it breathing. I sat in the corner with my knife and didn't move until dawn. When I finally opened the door, there were wet footprints on the platform. Not animal prints, not human either. Something in between. I glanced at the floor by the door. It was clean, no prints, but there was a dark stain near the threshold that could have been water. Or something else. The entries continued, becoming almost incoherent. Can't tell what's real anymore. Sleep deprivation or something worse. It tapped on the window last night. The south window. This tower is 40 feet off the ground. I looked at the south window. There was a smudge on the glass, right at the center, like someone had pressed their hand against it from outside. Tried to leave again. Made it about 100 yards before I heard it behind me, crashing through the brush. Ran back to the tower. It let me go. It's keeping me here. The second to last entry was dated 4 days ago. I think I know what it wants. The previous ranger's log mentioned something similar, but those entries were torn out. I found the pages in the stove, partially burned. Could only read fragments. Feeding cycle. Every 7 years. Don't let it see your fear. If you're reading this, leave now. Leave during daylight and don't look back. Don't stay after sunset. My mouth went dry. I checked my watch. It was already past 7. The sun had set over an hour ago. The final entry was dated yesterday. Just one sentence, written in shaky, barely legible handwriting. It's inside. I dropped the notebook like it had burned me. It hit the floor with a dull thud, pages splaying open. That's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from the stairs outside. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. I grabbed my jacket and my phone, moving toward the door. But another creak came from above. From the roof. Something was up there, moving across the wooden shingles with a sound like wet leather dragging over wood. I backed into the center of the room, watching the windows, watching the door, watching the ceiling. The footsteps on the stairs stopped. The movement on the roof stopped. Everything went absolutely silent. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, something tapped on the north window. Once, twice, 3 times. I spun toward it but saw only darkness and rain. Another tap came from the east window, then the west, then the south. It was circling the cabin, tapping on each window in sequence, and I realized with growing horror that it was counting, testing, learning which window I reacted to most strongly. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the logbook, shoved it in my jacket, and waited. I didn't look at the windows. I didn't react to the sounds. I sat in that chair until the first gray light of dawn started to filter through the rain clouds. The tapping had stopped sometime around 3 in the morning. The storm had passed. When there was enough light to see, I opened the door and looked down. The stairs were wet with rain, and there, on every single step, were those prints. Not animal, not human, something in between. I made it down the tower and found the trail exactly where it should have been. I hiked out in record time and reported everything to the ranger station. They sent someone up there the next day. The tower was empty. No logbook, no supplies, no evidence anyone had been there in years. But I still have the notebook. I've read it cover to cover a dozen times. The entries go back 15 years, but they're all in the same handwriting. And yesterday, I noticed something I'd missed before. On the inside back cover, there's a list of dates. They're spaced exactly 7 years apart. The last date on the list is next October. I've been driving trucks for 11 years, and I know Highway 12 through White Pass better than I know my own driveway. Seattle to Yakima, Yakima to Seattle, sometimes 3 times a week depending on the load. It's not a complicated route. You get on the highway, you drive through the mountains, you watch for ice in the winter and tourists in the summer, and you get off at your exit. 164 miles, give or take. I've done it in the middle of the day, I've done it at sunset, and I've done it more times than I can count in the middle of the night when the roads are empty and you've got nothing but your thoughts and the radio to keep you company. That February night started like any other night run. I left Yakima at 11:30 with a load of refrigerated goods heading for a distribution center in Tacoma. The weather was clear, temperature hovering right around freezing, roads were dry. Perfect conditions. I had a full tank of diesel, a thermos of coffee, and a podcast queued up about unsolved disappearances in national parks. Ironic, considering what was about to happen. I merged onto Highway 12 westbound and settled in for the drive. The first hour was smooth. I passed through Naches, started the climb into the mountains, passed a few cars heading the opposite direction. Normal. Routine. The kind of drive where your mind wanders and your hands operate on muscle memory. I noticed the first mile marker around the 30-mile point, just past where the highway starts to really wind through the Wenatchee National Forest. Mile marker 127. I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? But about 10 minutes later, I passed another marker. Mile marker 127, the exact same number. I figured I'd misread the first one, maybe saw a 7 that was actually a 1. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. I turned off the podcast and focused on the road. The white lines kept coming at me in the headlights. The trees were black walls on either side, and everything felt normal except for this small, nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something was slightly off. 5 minutes later, another marker appeared in my headlights. Mile marker 127. I know I didn't misread it this time because I slowed down specifically to check. 127. Clear as day. I checked my odometer. I'd traveled almost 15 miles since Natchez, which meant I should be hitting markers in the 130s at least. I grabbed my phone from the mount, and that's when I noticed it had no signal. Not unusual in the mountains, but my GPS was still working. And according to the map, I was exactly where I should be, on Highway 12. The little blue dot was moving along the road like normal. Everything looked right on the screen, even though those mile markers were telling me something completely different. I kept driving because what else was I going to do? Turn around? Go back to Yakima and tell my dispatcher that the mile markers were repeating so I couldn't deliver the load? I'd sound insane. Besides, the road itself looked normal. Same curves I'd driven 1,000 times, same steep drop-offs on the right side, same wall of rock on the left. I knew this highway. I convinced myself it was just vandalism, some kid switching the markers around as a prank. It happens sometimes. But then I passed mile marker 89. 89. I'd somehow gone backward 40 miles without turning around. My chest got tight. I checked the fuel gauge. 3/4 full. It had been 3/4 full when I left Yakima over an hour ago. It should have been closer to half by now. The next marker I passed was 214, then 52, then 127 again. They were appearing in random order now, numbers that made no sense, and the spaces between them were wrong too. Sometimes I'd see 2 markers within a 1/4 mile of each other. Sometimes I'd drive for what felt like 10 miles without seeing one at all. I tried the radio. Pure static on every station, AM and FM both. My phone still showed the GPS working, still showed me moving west on Highway 12. But the arrival time kept changing. First it said I'd arrive in 40 minutes. Then it said 2 hours. Then it jumped to 23 minutes. The numbers shifted every time I looked at it. I started watching for landmarks, things I knew I should see. There's a rest area with bathrooms and vending machines around the halfway point. I should have passed it by now. There's a scenic overlook where people pull off to take pictures of the valley. I'd driven past these places hundreds of times. None of them appeared. Just trees and darkness and those mile markers flashing past with their impossible numbers. Mile marker 341, mile marker 7, mile marker 999. That last one made me hit the brakes hard enough that the load shifted in the trailer. 999. Highway 12 doesn't have a mile marker 999. The highway isn't even that long. I pulled over onto the shoulder, put on my hazards, and got out of the cab. The cold hit me immediately. That sharp mountain cold that gets into your lungs and makes them ache. I walked around to the front of the truck, checked the headlights, checked the tires. I don't know. Maybe I was checking to make sure I was real and this was real and I hadn't fallen asleep at the wheel. Everything was solid. The pavement was solid under my boots. The truck was running, diesel smell mixing with pine smell in the cold air. In the distance, I could hear what sounded like another vehicle approaching from behind me, so I turned to look. Headlights were coming around the curve about a half-mile back. They got closer and closer, and then they passed the same spot and disappeared, like they'd driven into a wall of nothing. The sound cut off at exactly the same moment. No fade, no Doppler effect, just there 1 second and gone the next. I got back in the truck and started driving again, because standing on the side of a highway that apparently didn't follow normal rules seemed worse than keeping moving. I told myself I'd drive until I hit a town, any town, and I'd stop and wait for daylight. But no towns came. The road just kept unreeling in front of me, curve after curve, mile marker after mile marker, showing numbers that couldn't exist. My fuel gauge hadn't moved. It was still sitting at 3/4. I'd been driving for over 2 hours now, should have burned through at least a quarter tank. But the needle sat in exactly the same position. The coffee in my thermos was still hot. Not warm, hot. Like I'd just poured it, even though I'd filled it 3 hours ago. That's when I started to panic, really panic. My breathing got shallow, my hands were shaking on the wheel. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't moving forward at all. I was just driving in place, going through the motions while the same stretch of highway looped around me over and over. I thought about the podcast I'd been listening to, about people who vanished in the wilderness without explanation. Experienced hikers who knew the trails, who had GPS and emergency beacons, who were never seen again. What if it wasn't the wilderness that took them? What if it was something else? Something that could happen on a well-maintained highway just as easily as on a mountain trail? I passed mile marker 12, then immediately mile marker 21. The numbers were reversing now, mirroring each other. 45 and 54, 78 and 87. I was crying, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. I wanted off this road. I wanted to see my daughter's face. I wanted to be anywhere but trapped in this truck on this impossible highway with these markers that were playing some kind of game I didn't understand. The GPS was useless now, just showing my blue dot vibrating in place, and the arrival time had stopped updating entirely. It just blinked, over and over. Then I saw it. Mile marker 164, the end of Highway 12. I'd somehow reached the western terminus, even though I hadn't passed through any of the towns I should have seen. And right after that marker, I saw lights. Real lights. Gas station lights. I pulled off the highway into the parking lot so fast, I nearly jackknifed the trailer. There were other cars there, a couple of sedans getting fuel, completely normal. I checked my phone. Signal was back. The time said 1:47 a.m. I'd been on the road for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Exactly the amount of time it should have taken to drive from Yakima to this point. The fuel gauge now read just under half full. Everything was suddenly, impossibly normal. I went inside the gas station and asked the clerk if anything strange had happened on Highway 12 tonight. She looked at me like I was insane and said it had been a quiet shift. I bought a coffee I didn't need and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to stop shaking. Eventually, I delivered the load, filed my paperwork, drove home. But I've checked my dash cam footage from that night probably 50 times. The camera captured everything, every mile marker in perfect sequence, from Yakima to the gas station, 97, 98, 99, all the way up to 164. No repeats, no impossible numbers, nothing wrong at all. The only thing the camera didn't capture was the 23 minutes between mile marker 108 and mile marker 109. The timestamp jumps from 1:09 a.m. to 1:32 a.m. with no footage in between. Just a gap. 23 minutes of nothing. I still drive Highway 12. I still make the Seattle-Yakima run. But now I count every single mile marker as I pass it, and I keep waiting for the numbers to start repeating again. Because whatever happened that night, wherever I actually was for those 23 minutes, I have this terrible feeling that it's still out there, still waiting. And next time, I might not find my way back to that gas station. I need to tell you something about mushrooms that most people don't understand. They're not really plants. They're closer to animals than plants, genetically speaking. And what you see growing out of the ground is just the fruiting body. The actual organism lives underground, spreading through the soil in a network of thread-like filaments called mycelium. Some of these networks span miles. They're ancient, intelligent in their own alien way, and they're everywhere under your feet whether you see them or not. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what I found in the Olympic National Forest last September and why I haven't been back since. I've been foraging mushrooms professionally for 6 years. Restaurants pay good money for chanterelles, morels, porcini, especially if you can guarantee they're wild harvested from clean forests. I have my spots, places I've returned to year after year, and I know the seasons, the weather patterns, the specific conditions that make the mushrooms fruit. That September was perfect. We'd had rain after a dry August, the temperatures were dropping into the 50s at night, and I knew the chanterelles would be coming up in huge numbers. I packed my gear, drove out to a trailhead I'd used before, and hiked about 3 miles into an area where the old-growth Douglas firs create this permanent twilight even at noon. The mushrooms were everywhere, just like I'd predicted. Golden chanterelles pushing up through the duff, their frilly edges catching what little light filtered through the canopy. I was filling my baskets, working systematically through my usual patches, when I noticed something odd about 50 yards off my normal route. There was a clearing, maybe 30 feet across, where the undergrowth had died back. Not winter dieback. This was different. Everything was brown and withered like it had been poisoned. And in the center of this dead zone, there was a growth pattern I'd never seen before. Mushrooms, hundreds of them, growing in what looked like a perfect spiral that led to a raised mound in the middle. I should have left it alone. Any forager with sense knows that weird growth patterns mean the soil chemistry is wrong. Could be contamination, could be naturally occurring toxins. But I've got a degree in mycology, and I'd never seen anything like this arrangement. The mushrooms weren't any species I recognized. They were pale, almost translucent, with caps that looked wet even though it hadn't rained in 3 days. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, thinking I'd send them to a colleague at the university. Through the camera screen, I noticed something I hadn't seen with my naked eye. The caps were moving, not swaying in the breeze. There was no breeze. They were pulsing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that looked disturbingly like breathing. I put my phone away and moved closer, telling myself it was just the caps releasing spores, a normal biological function. But the closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The air smelled thick and sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. The ground felt spongy under my boots, not soft like normal forest floor, but spongy like I was walking on something with give to it, something that compressed and expanded under my weight. I knelt down next to the spiral pattern and examined the mushrooms more carefully. Their stems were translucent enough that I could see dark structures inside, almost like vessels or veins. The caps were definitely moving, a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed to be synchronized across all of them. I reached out to touch one, just barely brushed my finger against the cap, and it reacted. The mushroom contracted violently, the cap folding inward, and I felt a puff of air hit my hand. Not spores. Air. Like it had exhaled. I jerked back and watched as the reaction spread through the spiral, each mushroom contracting in sequence, the wave moving from the outer edge toward the center mound. When it reached the middle, the mound itself shifted. Just slightly, just enough that I saw the surface ripple like skin over muscle. That's when I realized the mound wasn't a mound. It was a mass of mycelium that had grown up out of the ground, and the spiral of mushrooms around it weren't separate organisms. They were all connected, all part of the same massive network, and I'd just triggered a response from the whole thing. I stood up slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb anything else. My rational brain was screaming at me to document this, to collect samples, to call someone from the university. But there was another part of my brain, the older part that remembers when humans were prey animals, that was screaming even louder to get away from this clearing. I compromised. I took more pictures, careful not to touch anything else, and I marked the location on my GPS. Then I backed away, keeping my eyes on the central mass, and I didn't turn around until I was back in the normal forest where the undergrowth was green and alive. I hiked back to my campsite about a quarter-mile away, where I'd set up a tent near a small stream. It was getting dark by then, that fast mountain darkness that drops like a curtain. I started a fire, made some food, and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was strange but explainable. Mushrooms could grow in unusual patterns. The pulsing was probably just spore release triggered by the disturbance I'd caused. The mound was probably just a particularly large fruiting body. Everything had a rational explanation. I even managed to eat some dinner and relax enough to think about going to sleep. That's when I noticed the smell. That same sweet, metallic smell from the clearing, but fainter, coming from somewhere nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around my campsite. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I pointed the light at the ground near my tent, and my stomach dropped. There were mushrooms growing in a line from the edge of the clearing toward my campsite. Small ones, just caps poking up through the needle litter. But they definitely hadn't been there when I set up camp 3 hours ago. Mushrooms don't grow that fast. They can't. Fruiting bodies take days to develop, sometimes weeks. I walked along the line with my flashlight, following it back toward the clearing. It was perfectly straight, like someone had drawn it with a ruler, and the mushrooms got progressively larger as they got closer to the dead zone. The last one, about 20 feet from the clearing's edge, was the size of a dinner plate. I could see the pulse even from several feet away, that rhythmic expansion and contraction. And as I watched, I saw something that made my hands start shaking. The stem of the mushroom was growing, not slowly, fast enough that I could see it happening in real time, pale tissue pushing up out of the ground, getting thicker, getting taller. In the 30 seconds I stood there, it grew at least 2 inches. I ran back to my campsite and started breaking everything down. Tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, everything got shoved into my pack with no care for organization. I just needed to get my gear and get out. The fire was still going, and I left it. Didn't even bother to put it out properly. I hoisted the pack onto my shoulders and turned toward the trail. And that's when I saw them. More mushrooms. Growing in a semicircle around the far side of my campsite, blocking the direct path to the trailhead. The pattern was unmistakable. They were cutting off my exit route, growing faster than anything should be able to grow. And they were all pulsing in perfect synchronization. I changed direction, pushed through the brush in a wide arc to avoid the mushroom line, and hit the trail about 100 yards further down than I'd planned. My headlamp beam bounced wildly as I jogged along the path, pack bouncing on my back, lungs burning from exertion and fear. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, counting the distance markers in my head, waiting to see the trailhead parking lot. 1 mile, half a mile, quarter mile. When I finally burst out onto the gravel parking area and saw my truck sitting there under the security light, I actually sobbed with relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. I started the engine and turned on every light the truck had. Headlights and fog lights and the light bar I use for night driving. I was about to put it in drive when I noticed something on my windshield. A smear of something pale and wet, right in the center of the glass. I turned on the wipers and it smeared worse, spreading across the windshield in streaks. I used the washer fluid, and after a few passes, it finally cleared enough that I could see. But in those few seconds before it washed away, I could have sworn I saw thread-like structures in the smear, white filaments that looked exactly like mycelium. I drove straight home, 5 hours without stopping. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I finally worked up the courage to return, I brought a colleague from the university and 2 grad students. We hiked in with proper sampling equipment, GPS coordinates logged, ready to document everything. We found my campsite easily enough. The fire ring was still there, my boot prints still visible in the soft ground near the stream. But the clearing was gone. We searched for 3 hours, using the GPS coordinates, using the landmarks I remembered. Nothing. Just normal old-growth forest, healthy undergrowth, regular mushrooms growing in regular patterns. My colleague thought I'd gotten the coordinates wrong, that maybe I'd marked the wrong location. But I know what I saw, and I know what I found when I got home that night and unpacked my gear. At the bottom of my backpack, wrapped in the spare shirt I'd used to cushion my sample containers, there was a mushroom. One of those pale, translucent ones from the spiral. I know I didn't pack it. I know I didn't touch any of them except for that one brush of my finger against the cap. But there it was, and it was still pulsing. I put it in a jar and kept it on my kitchen counter for 2 days, watching it, trying to figure out what to do with it. It didn't grow. It didn't seem to need soil or water. It just pulsed, that slow, rhythmic breathing motion, once every 8 seconds. On the 3rd morning, I woke up and went to make coffee, and the jar was empty. The lid was still screwed on tight. But the mushroom was gone. What was there instead was a fine network of white threads coating the inside of the glass. And when I looked closer, I could see they were moving, growing, spreading across the surface like cracks spreading through ice. I threw the jar away, sealed it in 3 plastic bags, and drove it to a dumpster on the other side of town. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that mycelium network still spreading somewhere under the Olympic National Forest. I think about how mushroom networks can span miles, how they communicate through chemical signals, how some scientists think they might be a form of natural intelligence we barely understand. And I think about that line of mushrooms that grew toward my campsite in just a few hours, how they cut off my escape route like they were hurting me. I haven't been back to the Olympics since September. I don't think I ever will. Because whatever I found in that clearing, I don't think it was just a mushroom. I think it was something much older, much larger, and much more aware than any organism has a right to be. I need to tell you something about mushrooms that most people don't understand. They're not really plants. They're closer to animals than plants, genetically speaking. And what you see growing out of the ground is just the fruiting body. The actual organism lives underground, spreading through the soil in a network of thread-like filaments called mycelium. Some of these networks span miles. They're ancient, intelligent in their own alien way, and they're everywhere under your feet whether you see them or not. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what I found in the Olympic National Forest last September, and why I haven't been back since. I've been foraging mushrooms professionally for 6 years. Restaurants pay good money for chanterelles, morels, porcini, especially if you can guarantee they're wild harvested from clean forests. I have my spots, places I've returned to year after year, and I know the seasons, the weather patterns, the specific conditions that make the mushrooms fruit. That September was perfect. We'd had rain after a dry August, the temperatures were dropping into the 50s at night, and I knew the chanterelles would be coming up in huge numbers. I packed my gear, drove out to a trailhead I'd used before, and hiked about 3 miles into an area where the old-growth Douglas firs create this permanent twilight even at noon. The mushrooms were everywhere, just like I'd predicted. Golden chanterelles pushing up through the duff, their frilly edges catching what little light filtered through the canopy. I was filling my baskets, working systematically through my usual patches, when I noticed something odd about 50 yards off my normal route. There was a clearing, maybe 30 feet across, where the undergrowth had died back. Not winter dieback, this was different. Everything was brown and withered like it had been poisoned, and in the center of this dead zone, there was a growth pattern I'd never seen before. Mushrooms, hundreds of them, growing in what looked like a perfect spiral that led to a raised mound in the middle. I should have left it alone. Any forager with sense knows that weird growth patterns mean the soil chemistry is wrong. Could be contamination, could be naturally occurring toxins. But I've got a degree in mycology, and I'd never seen anything like this arrangement. The mushrooms weren't any species I recognized. They were pale, almost translucent, with caps that looked wet even though it hadn't rained in 3 days. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, thinking I'd send them to a colleague at the university. Through the camera screen, I noticed something I hadn't seen with my naked eye. The caps were moving, not swaying in the breeze. There was no breeze. They were pulsing, expanding, and contracting in a rhythm that looked disturbingly like breathing. I put my phone away and moved closer, telling myself it was just the caps releasing spores, a normal biological function. But the closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. The air smelled thick and sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. The ground felt spongy under my boots, not soft like normal forest floor, but spongy like I was walking on something with give to it. Something that compressed and expanded under my weight. I knelt down, next to the spiral pattern, and examined the mushrooms more carefully. Their stems were translucent enough that I could see dark structures inside, almost like vessels or veins. The caps were definitely moving, a slow rhythmic pulse that seemed to be synchronized across all of them. I reached out to touch one, just barely brushed my finger against the cap, and it reacted. The mushroom contracted violently, the cap folding inward, and I felt a puff of air hit my hand. Not spores, air, like it had exhaled. I jerked back and watched as the reaction spread through the spiral, each mushroom contracting in sequence, the wave moving from the outer edge toward the center mound. When it reached the middle, the mound itself shifted. Just slightly, just enough that I saw the surface ripple like skin over muscle. That's when I realized the mound wasn't a mound. It was a mass of mycelium that had grown up out of the ground, and the spiral of mushrooms around it weren't separate organisms. They were all connected, all part of the same massive network. And I'd just triggered a response from the whole thing. I stood up slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb anything else. My rational brain was screaming at me to document this, to collect samples, to call someone from the university. But there was another part of my brain, the older part that remembers when humans were prey animals, that was screaming even louder to get away from this clearing. I compromised. I took more pictures, careful not to touch anything else, and I marked the location on my GPS. Then I backed away, keeping my eyes on the central mass, and I didn't turn around until I was back in the normal forest, where the undergrowth was green and alive. I hiked back to my campsite about a quarter-mile away, where I'd set up a tent near a small stream. It was getting dark by then, that fast mountain darkness that drops like a curtain. I started a fire, made some food, and tried to convince myself that what I had seen was strange but explainable. Mushrooms could grow in unusual patterns. The pulsing was probably just spore release triggered by the disturbance I'd caused. The mound was probably just a particularly large fruiting body. Everything had a rational explanation. I even managed to eat some dinner and relax enough to think about going to sleep. That's when I noticed the smell. That same sweet metallic smell from the clearing, but fainter, coming from somewhere nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam around my campsite. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then I pointed the light at the ground near my tent, and my stomach dropped. There were mushrooms growing in a line from the edge of the clearing toward my campsite. Small ones, just caps poking up through the needle litter. But they definitely hadn't been there when I set up camp 3 hours ago. Mushrooms don't grow that fast. They can't. Fruiting bodies take days to develop, sometimes weeks. I walked along the line with my flashlight, following it back toward the clearing. It was perfectly straight, like someone had drawn it with a ruler, and the mushrooms got progressively larger as they got closer to the dead zone. The last one, about 20 feet from the clearing's edge, was the size of a dinner plate. I could see the pulse even from several feet away, that rhythmic expansion and contraction. And as I watched, I saw something that made my hands start shaking. The stem of the mushroom was growing, not slowly, fast enough that I could see it happening in real time, pale tissue pushing up out of the ground, getting thicker, getting taller. In the 30 seconds I stood there, it grew at least 2 inches. I ran back to my campsite and started breaking everything down. Tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, everything got shoved into my pack with no care for organization. I just needed to get my gear and get out. The fire was still going, and I left it. Didn't even bother to put it out properly. I hoisted the pack onto my shoulders and turned toward the trail, and that's when I saw them. More mushrooms, growing in a semicircle around the far side of my campsite, blocking the direct path to the trailhead. The pattern was unmistakable. They were cutting off my exit route, growing faster than anything should be able to grow. And they were all pulsing in perfect synchronization. I changed direction, pushed through the brush in a wide arc to avoid the mushroom line, and hit the trail about 100 yards further down than I'd planned. My headlamp beam bounced wildly as I jogged along the path, pack bouncing on my back, lungs burning from exertion and fear. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, counting the distance markers in my head, waiting to see the trailhead parking lot. 1 mile, half a mile, quarter mile. When I finally burst out onto the gravel parking area and saw my truck sitting there under the security light, I actually sobbed with relief. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad, it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. I started the engine and turned on every light the truck had, headlights and fog lights, and the light bar I use for night driving. I was about to put it in drive when I noticed something on my windshield. A smear of something pale and wet, right in the center of the glass. I turned on the wipers and it smeared worse, spreading across the windshield in streaks. I used the washer fluid, and after a few passes, it finally cleared enough that I could see. But in those few seconds before it washed away, I could have sworn I saw thread-like structures in the smear. white filaments that looked exactly like mycelium. I drove straight home, 5 hours without stopping. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I finally worked up the courage to return, I brought a colleague from the university and 2 grad students. We hiked in with proper sampling equipment, GPS coordinates logged, ready to document everything. We found my campsite easily enough. The fire ring was still there, my boot prints still visible in the soft ground near the stream. But the clearing was gone. We searched for 3 hours, using the GPS coordinates, using the landmarks I remembered. Nothing. Just normal old-growth forest, healthy undergrowth, regular mushrooms growing in regular patterns. My colleague thought I'd gotten the coordinates wrong, that maybe I'd marked the wrong location. But I know what I saw. And I know what I found when I got home that night and unpacked my gear. At the bottom of my backpack, wrapped in the spare shirt I'd used to cushion my sample containers, there was a mushroom. One of those pale, translucent ones from the spiral. I know I didn't pack it. I know I didn't touch any of them except for that one brush of my finger against the cap. But there it was, and it was still pulsing. I put it in a jar and kept it on my kitchen counter for 2 days, watching it, trying to figure out what to do with it. It didn't grow. It didn't seem to need soil or water. It just pulsed, that slow, rhythmic breathing motion, once every 8 seconds. On the 3rd morning, I woke up and went to make coffee, and the jar was empty. The lid was still screwed on tight, but the mushroom was gone. What was there instead was a fine network of white threads coating the inside of the glass, and when I looked closer, I could see they were moving, growing, spreading across the surface like cracks spreading through ice. I threw the jar away, sealed it in 3 plastic bags, and drove it to a dumpster on the other side of town. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that mycelium network still spreading somewhere under the Olympic National Forest. I think about how mushroom networks can span miles, how they communicate through chemical signals, how some scientists think they might be a form of natural intelligence we barely understand. And I think about that line of mushrooms that grew toward my campsite in just a few hours, how they cut off my escape route like they were hurting me. I haven't been back to the Olympics since September. I don't think I ever will. Because whatever I found in that clearing, I don't think it was just a mushroom. I think it was something much older, much larger, and much more aware than any organism has a right to be. You ever been to Cape Disappointment? It's this headland on the southwest coast of Washington where the Columbia River dumps into the Pacific Ocean. The name isn't just dramatic, it's historical. Captain John Mears showed up there in 1788 looking for the river mouth and couldn't find it because of the fog. So he named the cape in frustration. 2 centuries later, that fog is still there, rolling in off the ocean without warning, thick enough that you can't see your hand in front of your face. I learned that the hard way last March when I went there to photograph the coastline for a project I was working on. I'm a photographer, mostly landscape work, some architectural stuff. And I'd been hired to put together a coffee table book about the Washington coast. Cape Disappointment was on my shot list because of the lighthouse, the dramatic cliffs, the way the forest comes right up to the edge of the rocks. I got there early, maybe 6 in the morning, hoping to catch the sunrise. The parking lot was empty except for my car, which wasn't surprising for a Thursday in March. Off-season, cold. Most people were smart enough to stay home. But the light was supposed to be perfect, golden hour hitting those cliffs just right. So I grabbed my camera bag and my tripod and headed for the coastal trail. The air was clear when I started. Visibility for miles, ocean stretching out gray and infinite under a pale sky. I could see the lighthouse in the distance, standing white against the dark rocks. Perfect. I set up my first shot near the trailhead, got some wide angles of the coastline, then started hiking north along the cliff path to get closer to the lighthouse. That's when I noticed the fog. It wasn't gradual. 1 minute the air was clear, the next minute there was this wall of white about 100 yards offshore, moving toward land. Not drifting, moving, like it had purpose. I've seen ocean fog before. It's common on this coast. But this was different. It was too thick, too uniform, and it was moving against the wind. I could feel the breeze coming off the ocean toward land, but the fog was pushing into it, advancing steadily like a slow-motion wave. I watched it reach the shore and start climbing the rocks, flowing upward instead of settling into the low spots like fog should. That was the first moment I thought about turning back. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. Fog is fog. It's just water vapor. It can't hurt you. I kept walking, keeping the cliff edge on my right, the forest on my left. The trail was well maintained, gravel path with wooden railings where it got close to drop-offs. Easy walking. But the fog caught up to me faster than I expected. One moment I could see 20 feet ahead. The next moment I was wrapped in white so thick I couldn't see the ground under my feet. I stopped and pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, which just made things worse because the light bounced off the fog and came right back at me. I could hear the ocean, waves hitting rocks maybe 50 feet to my right, and I could hear the trees rustling to my left. But I couldn't see anything. The smart move would have been to stop, wait for it to clear. But I was already annoyed about losing my golden hour light, and I figured if I just kept moving forward, I'd walk out of it eventually. So I kept going, one hand on the railing when I could find it, moving slowly, testing each step before I committed my weight. My camera bag bumped against my hip with each step, and I started counting paces to keep track of distance. 100 paces, 200, 300. I should have reached the lighthouse area by now, or at least the viewing platform that I knew was along this trail. But there was nothing. Just more fog and more trail and that constant sound of waves that seemed to be getting louder, closer. I stopped and pulled out my phone again to check the map. And that's when I saw that I had no signal. Not even emergency calls only, just blank. Like the phone couldn't find any towers at all. The GPS was spinning, trying to lock onto satellites, but it couldn't get a fix through the fog. I turned around to head back the way I came, figuring I'd just wait this out in the parking lot. But when I looked back, the trail behind me looked exactly the same as the trail ahead. Same fog, same gravel, same wooden railing disappearing into white. I couldn't tell which direction I'd come from. I tried to remember if I'd passed any distinctive features, a bent tree or a marker post. But the fog had erased everything. For the first time, I felt actual fear, not just annoyance. I was lost on a trail I'd been confidently walking just minutes before, and the fog wasn't lifting. If anything, it was getting thicker, pressing in around me like something solid. That's when I heard the footsteps. Behind me, coming from the direction I thought was back toward the parking lot. Steady footsteps on gravel, getting closer. I felt a rush of relief, thinking it was another hiker, someone who knew the trail better than I did. I called out, "Hey, I'm up here. I think I got turned around in the fog." The footsteps stopped. Complete silence, except for the waves. Then they started again, but now they were in front of me, coming from the direction I'd been heading. Same rhythm, same pace, but they'd somehow moved without me hearing them circle around me. I spun toward the sound and saw nothing but fog. "Hello?" I called again. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen, listening. My heart was hammering and I was breathing too fast, taking in shallow gulps of the wet air. Then I heard them again, off to my left this time, in the forest off the trail. Multiple sets of footsteps now, all moving in the same rhythm, all getting closer. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures, thinking maybe the flash would show me something my eyes couldn't see. The first shot showed nothing but white fog. The second shot showed a shadow, human-shaped, standing about 10 feet in front of me. The third shot showed 3 shadows, closer now, maybe 6 feet away. I lowered the camera and looked with my eyes and saw nothing. Raised the camera and took another shot, and there were 5 of them now, surrounding me in a semicircle. And they were so close in the frame that I could see they weren't quite right. The proportions were wrong, arms too long, heads tilted at angles that human necks shouldn't bend. I ran. I don't know which direction. I just picked a direction and ran, holding my camera bag against my chest so it wouldn't bounce, my other hand stretched out in front of me to feel for obstacles. I hit the wooden railing with my hip, hard enough to bruise, which meant I was still on the trail at least. I followed the railing, running blind through the fog. And behind me, I could hear those footsteps, keeping pace. They didn't speed up, didn't slow down, just maintained that same steady rhythm like they had all the time in the world. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been 2 minutes, could have been 20. My lungs were burning and my legs were shaking, but I didn't stop because those footsteps never stopped. Then suddenly I broke out of the fog. One step I was in complete white, the next step I was in clear air, and I could see the ocean and the rocks and the trail stretching ahead of me. I spun around and looked at the fog bank. It had stopped. There was a perfect line where the fog ended and the clear air began, like someone had drawn it with a ruler. And right at that line, I could see shapes moving inside the white. Not breaking through, just moving back and forth like they were pacing, waiting. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the fog, and I didn't turn around until I'd put at least 50 yards between me and that line. The parking lot was another quarter mile. I walked it in what felt like seconds, and when I reached my car, I got in and locked the doors and just sat there shaking for probably 10 minutes. Then I did something stupid. I pulled out my camera and reviewed the photos I'd taken in the fog. The first few were what I expected, just white, useless shots. But the ones with the shadows, the shapes I'd seen through the viewfinder, those were clear. Too clear. There were figures in the fog, and they were all standing in a line facing the camera, facing me. And I could see their faces now, or what passed for faces. They were smooth, featureless, except for dark holes where eyes should be. And every single one of them was tilted at the exact same angle, heads cocked to the side like dogs hearing a strange sound. I deleted those photos. Right there in the parking lot, I went through and deleted every single shot from that morning. And then I emptied the trash folder. And then I formatted the memory card completely. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just fog and shadows and my imagination. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I drove home and tried to forget about it, told my client that the weather hadn't cooperated and I'd need to reschedule the Cape Disappointment shoot. But I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about those footsteps, how they'd surrounded me, how they'd moved through positions without me hearing them actually move. A week later, I went back. Different day, different time, late afternoon instead of early morning. The weather was clear, not a trace of fog anywhere. I parked in the same lot and walked the same trail, and this time I could see everything. The lighthouse, the cliffs, the viewing platforms I should have passed. The whole trail was maybe a mile long, easy walk, nothing confusing about it. I tried to figure out where I'd been when I got lost, where I'd run from, but it all looked so normal in the daylight that I started to doubt my own memory. Maybe I had just panicked, gotten disoriented. Maybe those photos had been artifacts, light reflecting off water droplets, creating patterns that looked like faces. I almost convinced myself. Then I saw it. About halfway along the trail, there was a break in the trees where you could look inland, away from the ocean. And back in the forest, maybe 200 yards from the trail, there was fog. A pocket of it, hanging in the trees, and it was the same kind of fog. Too thick, too white, too uniform. While I watched, it moved. Not drifted, moved, flowing between the tree trunks like something alive. And right at the edge of that fog bank, I saw a figure. Just for a second, just a silhouette, before it stepped back into the white and disappeared. But I saw it, and I saw the way its head was tilted. I left, got back in my car, and drove straight home. I turned down the rest of the Washington Coast project, told my client I had a family emergency and couldn't continue. I've done a lot of landscape work since then, but never on the coast. Never anywhere near Cape Disappointment. Because I know what I saw in those photos before I deleted them. And I know what I saw standing at the edge of that fog in the forest. There's something in that fog. Something that uses it to hunt, maybe. Or something that is the fog. And whatever it is, it's still there. Waiting for the next person who decides to take a walk on a foggy morning. I got lucky. I ran the right direction and broke free. But I keep wondering about all those people who vanished on coastal trails over the years. Experienced hikers who knew the routes, who had proper gear, who just disappeared. I wonder if they ran the wrong direction. I wonder if they're still running, trapped in that white, hearing those footsteps that never stop, never slow down, never quite catch up, but never fall behind either. I wonder if I'll ever stop thinking about it. There's something you need to understand about abandoned places. They're not really empty. Sure, there's no people, no lights, no movement. But there's still something there. An echo, maybe? Or a residue of all the things that happened when the place was alive. I never believed that until I spent 3 hours in an old logging camp in the North Cascades. And now I can't stop believing it. I document abandoned places for a living, or at least that's what I tell people when they ask what I do. Urban exploration, industrial archaeology, whatever you want to call it. I go to places that everyone else has forgotten, take photos, write up histories, post them online. It started as a hobby and turned into something I could actually make money from through ad revenue and patron subscriptions. People love seeing these ghost towns and abandoned factories, the way nature reclaims everything we build. I'd heard about the old camp from a forestry blog I follow. It was a 1970s operation that shut down after an accident, one of those logging disasters that made the news for about a week before everyone moved on to the next tragedy. 7 men dead. Something about a widowmaker, a hung-up tree that came down wrong and took out half a crew. The company folded within a year. Litigation and bad press and OSHA fines piling up until there was nothing left but empty buildings slowly rotting back into the forest. The blog post included rough coordinates and a warning that the access road was mostly washed out, 4-wheel drive recommended. Perfect. I loaded my camera gear into my Jeep on a clear September morning and headed north into the Cascades. The drive took longer than I expected. The highway was fine, but once I turned onto the Forest Service road, it got rough fast. Potholes big enough to swallow a tire, sections where mudslides had covered the gravel, branches scraping both sides of the vehicle. I pushed through for about 8 miles, until I reached a point where a fallen tree blocked the road completely. No way around it, too big to move. So I parked and decided to hike the rest of the way. According to my GPS, the camp was only about 1.5 miles further up the road. Easy walk. The forest was quiet. That's the first thing I noticed. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling the branches. Just my footsteps on the gravel and my own breathing. The trees here were massive. Old-growth cedar and Douglas fir that had somehow survived the logging operations. Their trunks wide enough that 3 people holding hands couldn't circle them. They created this cathedral effect. Columns of wood rising into a canopy so thick that even midday felt like dusk. I kept walking, checking my GPS every few minutes. And about 40 minutes in, I saw the first building. It was a bunkhouse, long and low. Windows broken out, door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The wood was gray with age and covered in moss, and there were saplings growing up through gaps in the floorboards. I took some exterior shots, then moved inside, carefully testing each step before putting my weight down. The interior was surprisingly intact. Bunk frames still bolted to the walls, a few rotted mattresses, some metal lockers standing open and empty. I photographed everything, methodical, professional, looking for those little details that tell a story. A faded pin-up calendar from 1972. A work boot so dried out it crumbled when I touched it. Graffiti on one wall that said, "Timber Beast Local 1349, with a crude drawing of a chainsaw. I moved through 3 more buildings over the next hour. A mess hall with tables still set up, plates and cups scattered across the surfaces like everyone had just walked away mid-meal. An equipment shed filled with rusted tools and chain links thick as my wrist. An office building with filing cabinets tipped over, paperwork scattered and water damaged beyond reading. Standard stuff, the kind of decay I'd documented 100 times before. But the whole time I was shooting, I had this feeling that something was off. Not wrong, exactly, just not quite right. Like someone had set the buildings down at slightly wrong angles, or the spaces between them were a few feet different than they should be. Then I found the main yard, the open area where they would have processed the logs. And that's where I saw the equipment. A massive yard or tower. This skeletal steel structure used to haul logs out of steep terrain, still standing but listing to one side. A couple of old trucks, cabs rusted through, tires long gone. And in the center of it all, a pile of logs. Not rotted, not moss-covered like everything else. Fresh-cut logs, or at least they looked fresh. The ends still showing that bright yellow color that cedar has when it's newly sawn. I walked over to them, confused, thinking maybe someone was still working this area, maybe I'd gotten the history wrong. I put my hand on one of the logs, and it was solid, real, the bark still tight to the wood. That's when I heard the chainsaw. The sound came from somewhere deeper in the forest, that distinctive high-pitched whine of a 2-stroke engine running full throttle, cutting through wood. Then another one started up. And another, until there were maybe 5 or 6 of them all running at once, overlapping each other. I spun around, looking for the source, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees, and underneath the chainsaws I could hear voices. Men shouting to each other, calling out warnings, the kind of rough-working voices you hear on any construction site or logging operation. I pulled out my camera and started filming, sweeping across the empty yard, trying to capture the audio. The sounds got louder, closer, and then I heard the crack of a tree starting to fall. That unmistakable sound of wood fibers tearing, that long, creaking groan, and then the rush of air as something massive comes down. The crash shook the ground under my feet. It came from my left, maybe 100 yards into the forest, and it was followed by more shouting, but different now. Panicked, screaming, someone yelling, "Look out!" and someone else just screaming, wordless terror, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I stood there with my camera still recording, my hands shaking so bad the footage would be useless, and I waited for something else to happen. Nothing did. The silence stretched out for maybe 30 seconds, which doesn't sound like long, but try standing perfectly still in a dead, quiet forest, counting off 30 seconds while your heart tries to hammer its way out of your chest. Then the chainsaws started again. Same sounds, same pattern, same voices calling to each other like nothing had happened. I realized I was hearing a loop. The same sequence of sounds playing over and over. And now that I was listening for it, I could hear where it repeated. The same laugh from one of the workers. The same warning shout. The same tree falling in the exact same way. I backed away from the log pile, still filming. And that's when I noticed the shadows. They were wrong. The sun was behind me, coming from the south, which meant shadows should be falling to the north. But the shadows in the yard were pointing east, like the sun was in a completely different position. And they were moving. Not the slow movement you get from the sun tracking across the sky, but active movement. Shadows of people walking, bending, working. I could see the shadow of someone carrying a long object, probably a tool or piece of equipment. I could see the shadow of someone climbing the yarder tower. But when I looked at the actual tower, there was nobody there. The loop reached the tree falling again. Same crack, same groan, same crash, same screaming. This time I was ready for it, and I kept filming. And I saw something I'd missed the first time. Right when the screaming started, the shadows all converged on one spot at the edge of the yard. They piled on top of each other, overlapping, and in the center of that mass of shadows, I could see something that looked like it was struggling. The screams cut off, the silence fell, and the shadows separated and went back to their previous patterns like nothing had happened. I should have left right then. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get out. But I've got this stubborn streak that's gotten me in trouble before. I wanted to understand what I was seeing. I wanted documentation. So I pulled up the history on my phone, using the cached data since I had no signal out here. And I found the news article about the accident. 7 dead, like the blog post had said. But the details were worse than I'd imagined. A hung-up tree had been dislodged by another tree falling nearby, and it had come down on top of a crew that was working in a processing area. The article said it happened so fast that nobody had time to run. It listed the names of the dead, ages ranging from 22 to 56, and it included a detail that made my blood go cold. The accident happened at 2:17 p.m. on August 15th, 1973. I checked my watch. 2:14 p.m. The loop I was hearing was running on a schedule, and I was standing right in the middle of where it had happened. I had 3 minutes, maybe less, before the loop reached the accident again. And I suddenly didn't want to be anywhere near this place when it did. I started backing toward the trail, keeping my camera on the yard, and the chainsaws got louder. The voices got clearer. I could make out individual words now, one guy complaining about the heat, Another one talking about what he was going to do that weekend. Normal conversation, the kind of talk that fills empty space between more important things. Except these men had been dead for 50 years. 2:15. The tree started to fall. I could hear it clearly now, could hear exactly where it was coming from. And I turned to look, even though I didn't want to. There was nothing there. No falling tree, no movement at all. But the sound was absolutely real. The crash came and the ground shook and the screaming started, and this time I could hear individual voices. A young voice yelling for his dad, an older voice calling out a name, someone praying in Spanish, and underneath it all, this wet, crushing sound that I knew was the sound of that tree hitting flesh and bone. And I couldn't stop hearing it, couldn't make it stop even when I covered my ears, because it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the place itself, from the ground and the buildings and the air. I ran, dropped my camera, just let it fall, and I ran back toward the trail. Behind me, the screaming cut off, and the silence fell. And then the chainsaws started up again, beginning the loop one more time. I didn't stop running until I hit the main Forest Service road. And even then, I kept moving at a fast walk, checking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see shadows following me or hear those chainsaws getting closer. Nothing followed. The forest stayed quiet. By the time I reached my Jeep, I was covered in sweat despite the cool air, and my legs were shaking so bad I had to sit down for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I left my camera behind. It's still there, probably, lying in that yard with 50 years of echoes playing around it. I filed a report with the Forest Service claiming I'd lost expensive equipment and asking about salvage options. And they told me the coordinates I gave them didn't match any known logging camps. They said the area I described had never been logged. It was old growth preservation zone, and there were no structures of any kind in that location. I showed them the photos I'd already uploaded from the first few buildings before I reached the yard, and they just looked confused and said the images must be from somewhere else, because that definitely wasn't in their district. I've looked at those photos maybe 1,000 times since then. The bunkhouse, the mess hall, the equipment shed, all clearly visible, clearly real. But when I zoom in on certain details, I see things I missed while I was there. Shadows in windows that don't match any light source. A figure standing in the background of one shot, blurry and indistinct, even though I was alone. And in one photo, the one I took of that graffiti in the bunkhouse, if you look closely at the wall beneath the writing, you can see other names. Dozens of them, scratched into the wood, and every single one matches the names from that 1973 accident report. I don't do urban exploration anymore. I can't. Because now when I look at abandoned places, I don't see empty buildings. I see all the moments that happened there, all the people who worked and lived and died in those spaces. And I wonder how many of them are still there, still going through their routines, still experiencing their worst moments over and over again. That logging camp is still out there somewhere in the North Cascades, whether the Forest Service acknowledges it or not. And every day at 2:17 p.m., 7 men die in exactly the same way, and the chainsaws start up again, and the loop continues. I hope nobody else ever finds it. I hope it stays lost, because some echoes shouldn't be heard. Some moments should stay buried in the past where they belong. Let me tell you about the last time I went hunting in the Colville National Forest. I say last time because I haven't been back, and I don't think I ever will. I've been bow hunting for almost 15 years, mostly deer and elk, and I take it seriously. I scout locations months in advance, set up trail cameras to track animal movements, learn the patterns. By the time season opens, I know exactly where to set up my stand and exactly what paths the animals use. It's not just about killing something. It's about understanding the ecosystem, being part of it, reading the signs that most people walk right past without seeing. That's what I thought I was doing anyway, until I checked my cameras last November and realized that something had been reading my signs too. I'd set up 4 trail cameras in a remote section of forest about 12 miles from the nearest road. Good elk country, thick timber mixed with small meadows, a creek running through for water. I'd been working this area for 3 seasons, and I had it dialed in. The cameras were positioned at key points along game trails, motion-activated, shooting photos every time something walked past. I'd check them every 2 weeks during the off-season, swap out SD cards, replace batteries, make sure everything was working. It's routine maintenance. Boring, but necessary. This particular trip was in early November, about 2 weeks before rifle season opened. And I was expecting to see the usual stuff. Deer, elk, maybe some bear, occasionally a cougar if I got lucky. The first camera was fine. Hundreds of photos of a small herd of mule deer using the trail regularly, a coyote passing through, some turkeys. Standard. The second camera was about a quarter-mile away, positioned where 2 trails intersected, and that's where things started to get strange. The first batch of photos showed normal activity, animals coming and going. But then, around day 9 of the 2-week period, something changed. There was a photo of my third camera. Not the camera's location, I mean a photo of the actual camera. Like someone had walked up to camera 3, removed it from the tree, and carried it past camera 2. The photo was clear enough that I could read the serial number on the housing. I stood there staring at the image on my laptop, trying to make sense of it. Camera 3 was a mile away through rough terrain. Nobody should be out here. It was private timber company land, and I had permission to hunt it. But that didn't mean someone else couldn't have wandered in. Poachers, maybe, or another hunter who'd gotten lost. But why would they take a trail camera and then walk it past another trail camera? It didn't make any sense. I kept scrolling through the images. 3 hours after the camera photo, there was an image of my backpack. The one I used for day hunts, distinctive orange and black pattern. Clear as day, hanging from what looked like a branch, swaying slightly like someone had just hung it there and walked away. My backpack was at home. I was sure of it. I'd used it 2 weeks ago when I'd set up the cameras. But I'd taken it home with me. I distinctly remembered loading it into my truck. I went to my garage and checked, and yes, there it was, sitting on the shelf where I always kept it. So either I had 2 identical backpacks and had forgotten about it, or something had taken a photo of my backpack 2 weeks ago and was now showing it to me. Neither option made sense. I went back to the laptop and continued through the images, my hands starting to shake. The next photo showed my hunting stand. Not the location where I'd set up my stand, but the actual stand itself, photographed from ground level, looking up. You could see the camouflage fabric, the safety harness dangling, the bow holder I'd installed. Problem was, my stand was attached to a tree about half a mile from camera 2, in completely the opposite direction from camera 3. The photos continued. My thermos, my knife, my spare bow release, my lucky hat. Every piece of equipment I regularly used, photographed individually, like someone was taking inventory. Like something was documenting what I brought into the forest, learning my tools, my patterns. The timestamps showed these photos were taken over the course of 3 days, roughly every 6 hours, and they were interspersed with normal game photos. A deer would walk past, then 2 hours later there'd be a photo of another piece of my gear. Then 4 hours later, another deer. Whatever was taking these photos was working around the natural traffic, waiting for clear moments. Then the photos changed. Instead of my equipment, they started showing me. The first one was taken from behind, showing the back of my head and shoulders as I worked on something, probably adjusting a camera based on my posture. But I hadn't been out here in 2 weeks. This photo was dated 4 days ago. I was at work 4 days ago. I had witnesses. I had timesheets. But there I was in the image, clear as anything, wearing the same camo jacket I always wore. Same cap, same stance. The next photo was from the side, closer, showing my profile as I looked at something in my hands. Then from the front, but not quite right. The angle was wrong, too low, like the camera was sitting on the ground, pointing up. I grabbed my truck keys and headed back out there. I needed to see these cameras in person, needed to understand what was happening. It was getting late, maybe 4 in the afternoon. But I had a few hours of daylight left, and I couldn't wait until morning. The drive took 40 minutes, and the hike took another hour. And by the time I reached camera 2, the sun was starting to set. The camera was exactly where I'd left it, strapped to a tree about 6 feet up, pointed at the trail intersection. Nothing looked disturbed. I pulled the SD card and swapped it for a blank one, then continued to camera 3. That's when I found the pattern. Camera 3 wasn't on its tree anymore. It was lying on the ground about 20 feet away, lens pointed back toward the tree it had been attached to. The straps were undone, not broken, carefully removed. And arranged in a line between the camera and the tree were items from my gear. My spare bowstring, a granola bar wrapper I'd left in my stand, a glove I thought I'd lost last season. 7 items total, perfectly spaced, leading from the camera to the tree like a path, or like an invitation. I picked up the camera and checked it. No damage, still had battery, but the SD card was missing. I looked around, scanning the ground, and found it placed carefully on a flat rock about 10 feet away. Next to it was a photo. A physical photo, the kind you print out, except it was a screenshot from a trail camera. It showed me, standing exactly where I was standing right now. Looking down at a rock, the timestamp said it was taken 20 minutes from now. I looked up at the trees, spinning in a circle, trying to see where it might be watching from, what camera angle could have taken that future photo. There was nothing. No cameras, no glints of lens, nothing but trees and the fading light. I should have left. I should have gathered my cameras and gotten out of there. But I needed to check camera 4, needed to know what it had recorded. Camera 4 was positioned on my hunting stand tree, pointing down at the base to catch anything approaching my setup. I jogged toward it, breath coming hard, branches grabbing at my jacket. The stand tree was old growth, massive fir with bark thick as my hand, and I'd chosen it specifically because it gave me great sight lines in all directions. I came around a bend in the trail and stopped. My stand was on the ground. The whole thing ripped free from the tree, sitting in a crumpled heap at the base. But that wasn't what made my blood freeze. Sitting in the stand, as if it was waiting for something, was a figure. Not human, not animal. Something in between. It had the basic shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging past where knees should be. The legs bent backward at the joint. And it was looking at me. Not looking at where I'd been, looking at where I was, tracking my movement as I stood frozen on the trail. In the fading light, I couldn't make out details of the face, just dark holes where eyes might be and a shape that might have been a mouth. It stood up, slowly, deliberately, unfolding from the wreckage of my stand, and I realized it was tall, easily 7 feet, and it was holding something. My camera. Camera 4. It raised the camera and pointed it at me, and I heard the mechanical click of the shutter. Once, twice, 3 times. Like it was documenting me the same way it had documented my equipment, learning me, recording me, adding me to whatever collection it was building. I backed away. Slow at first, then faster. Then I was running, crashing through the brush, my lungs burning, branches hitting my face, and I didn't care. I could hear it behind me, not running, just walking, but keeping pace somehow, those long footsteps covering ground faster than they should. I didn't look back. I just ran, following the trail by memory, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly, showing me fragments of trees and rocks and nothing that made sense. When I finally broke out onto the logging road where my truck was parked, I threw myself in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. In the rearview mirror, I could see the trailhead, and standing just at the edge of the light, barely visible, was that shape. Still holding the camera, still watching. I reported the cameras as stolen, filed a police report, described them as expensive equipment taken by unknown persons. I didn't mention what I'd seen because I'd sound insane. 3 weeks later, I received a package at my house. No return address, just my name and address in printed labels. Inside was an SD card and a note written in my own handwriting that said, "You left these." I recognized the handwriting because it was mine, identical to my signature, my style. But I never wrote that note. The SD card contained 14,000 photos. All of me. Taken over the course of 3 years. Every hunting trip I'd made to that forest, photographed from angles I never saw, distances that shouldn't have been possible. Me setting up cameras. Me checking cameras. Me sitting in my stand. Me walking trails. Me at my truck. Me at home in my driveway, loading gear. Hundreds of photos of me sleeping in my tent on camping trips, taken from inside the tent, from angles that showed I was alone, but the camera was somehow there. The final photo was taken from my kitchen window 2 days before the package arrived. It showed me sitting at my laptop, looking at trail camera photos, looking at the screen that showed my backpack hanging from a branch. And in the reflection of my window, barely visible, was that shape. Standing in my yard, holding a camera, pointed at me. I moved 3 months later. Different state, sold all my hunting equipment, never went back. But sometimes I wonder if it matters. Because that thing spent 3 years learning my patterns, my routines, my behavior. It knows how I think, how I move, what I'll do in any situation. It studied me the way I studied the animals I hunted. And the last photo in that collection, the one I haven't told anyone about, was a photo of my new house. Taken a week before I bought it. Before I even knew it existed, like it knew where I would go, like it was already waiting. My family doesn't talk about what happened on Highway 14 anymore. My wife says it was stress, that we all experienced some kind of shared hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and too much time in the car. My kids don't say anything at all. They just get quiet whenever we drive anywhere near the Columbia River Gorge. But I know what we saw. I know where we went. And I know we're lucky we got out. We were driving back from a camping trip in the Cascades, taking the scenic route along the Columbia River because my daughter wanted to see the waterfalls. It was late afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock, and we should have been home by dinner. The highway was busy, Tourist season traffic backed up behind RVs and out-of-state plates, everyone doing 10 miles under the speed limit to take pictures of the Gorge. My wife was navigating, I was driving. The kids were in the back arguing about something I'd stopped paying attention to. Normal family road trip stuff. We'd done this drive a dozen times. That's when my phone's GPS started acting strange. The route it had been showing suddenly changed, suggested a detour that would save us 40 minutes. An alternate route that cut inland, away from the highway traffic. I looked at my wife and she shrugged. Said, why not? We'd been crawling along for the past 20 miles. So I took the exit the GPS indicated, a small turnoff near Beacon Rock that I'd never noticed before. The road was paved, well maintained, with a faded green sign that said, Historic Route 14, Local Access. Nothing unusual, nothing that made me think twice. The road curved away from the river, heading into the hills through thick forest. The traffic disappeared behind us immediately, and it was just us on this winding 2-lane road with trees pressing in from both sides. The light changed, got dimmer, that filtered green quality you get under heavy canopy. My daughter asked how much longer, and I checked the GPS. It said 32 minutes to home. We'd been driving for 5 minutes, which meant we should be making good time. The road kept winding. No other cars, no houses, just trees and more trees. 10 minutes in, my son pointed out the window and said, "Look, an old gas station." It was set back from the road, one of those vintage places with the rounded pumps and the big glass globes on top. Art Deco style, probably from the 30s or 40s. Except it looked operational. Lights on inside, a car parked by the pumps. An old car, something from maybe the 50s. Fins and chrome, powder blue paint. I slowed down to look, and my wife said it must be a restoration project. Someone fixing it up for the Historical Society, maybe. We kept driving. The GPS said 29 minutes to home. The numbers were counting down normally, but we'd been on this detour for almost 15 minutes, and I hadn't seen any signs indicating we'd rejoin the main highway. That's when we started seeing the buildings. Small ones at first, scattered along the road. A diner with a neon sign that said open, even though it was broad daylight. A motel with a vacancy sign, the kind with individual cabins. A hardware store with a wooden false front. All of them had that same vintage quality, like they'd been pulled from a different decade, and all of them looked occupied. There were cars parked outside, people moving around inside, completely normal, except nothing about this felt normal. My wife pulled out her phone to look up where we were, but she had no signal. None of us did. The buildings got closer together, turned into an actual town. Main Street, storefronts, sidewalks, streetlights. People walking around in clothes that were just slightly wrong. Women in full skirts and heels, men in hats and suits, kids in clothing that looked handmade. Nobody was in modern dress. Nobody was wearing jeans or sneakers or anything from this century. I slowed the car to maybe 20 miles an hour, staring at the town around us, and my wife grabbed my arm and said we should turn around. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the road behind us was gone. Just more town, stretching back the way we'd come, like we'd been driving through it for miles. I pulled over in front of what looked like a town square, a small park with benches and a gazebo. My hands were shaking on the wheel. The GPS still said 26 minutes to home, but the map had changed. Instead of showing the highway, it showed us sitting in the middle of a network of streets, a whole town that shouldn't exist. My daughter was crying quietly in the back seat. My son was pressed against the window, staring at the people walking past. They were staring back. Not hostile, just curious. like they didn't see many visitors. An old man walked up to my window, and I rolled it down halfway, keeping my hand on the shifter ready to drive away if I needed to. He smiled, friendly enough, and said, "You folks passing through?" His accent was strange, formal, like he was from a black and white movie. I said, "Yes, we were just trying to get home." Could he point us toward the highway? He looked confused for a second, and then his face cleared and he said, "Oh, you'll be wanting the main road, but you can't leave yet." My wife asked why not, and he said, "Bell hasn't rung. Nobody leaves until the bell rings. That's the rule." I didn't wait to hear more. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading down what looked like the main street, looking for any road that led out of town. But every street just led to more streets, more buildings, more people in their vintage clothes watching us drive past. The architecture changed as we went, got older. Victorian houses mixed with craftsman bungalows, mixed with buildings that looked frontier era, raw wood and hand-carved details. It was like the town had been built in layers, each generation adding to the last, but none of it aging. Everything looked maintained. Fresh paint, clean windows, like time had stopped. My son said, "Dad, look at the signs." I'd been too focused on driving to pay attention, but he was right. The business signs were from different eras. A shop called Telegraph and Wireless Services, a restaurant advertising modern cuisine, hamburgers 15C Zao, a movie theater with a marquee listing films from the 40s, another showing films from the 70s. The town wasn't just old, it was all eras at once. Decades compressed into a few blocks, and the people matched. I saw a woman in an 1800s dress walking next to a man in a leisure suit, a kid on a bicycle from the 50s riding past a couple in bell-bottoms. We'd been driving through the town for 20 minutes when my wife spotted the church. Big white building with a steeple, and mounted in the steeple was a bell. She said, "That's what the old man meant. That's the bell that has to ring." I didn't know what good it would do, but I pulled into the church parking lot and got out. The air felt wrong, thick and still like we were inside a building, even though we were outside. My family stayed in the car, and I walked up to the church steps. The door was unlocked. Inside was dim, afternoon light filtering through stained glass, and sitting in the pews were maybe 30 people. All facing forward, all completely still. I said hello and nobody moved. I walked down the aisle and not a single person turned to look at me. When I got close enough to see their faces, I realized they were all staring at the same point on the wall behind the altar. There was nothing there, just blank white paint. But their eyes were locked on it with absolute focus. I waved my hand in front of one woman's face, and she didn't blink. I touched her shoulder, and she was warm, breathing, alive, but completely unresponsive. They were all like that. 30 people frozen in place, watching nothing. I ran back to the car and told my family what I'd seen. My wife was pale, gripping the door handle, and she said we needed to get out now, rules or no rules. I got back in and started driving again. Faster this time, not caring about stop signs or lanes. The town kept going, block after block, and the sun wasn't moving. It was stuck in that same late afternoon position, shadows falling at the same angle no matter how long we drove. My daughter was sobbing now, and my son was silent, and I was gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. That's when we heard it, a bell, deep and resonant, ringing out across the town. It came from the church steeple, echoing off the buildings, and the moment it rang, the town changed. People stopped walking. Cars stopped moving. Everyone turned to face the same direction, that same empty stare I'd seen on the faces in the church. The bell rang 3 times, and on the 3rd ring, my GPS changed. It showed a road straight ahead, leading out of town. The map had updated, showing an exit route that definitely hadn't been there before. I drove toward it, watching the frozen people around us. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw them all start moving again, walking toward our car. Not running, just walking with that same deliberate pace, all in unison, all with the same blank expression. We reached the edge of town, and there was the road, leading back into the forest. I gunned the engine, and we shot forward. And in the mirror, I watched the town recede behind us. Except it was receding wrong, shrinking faster than it should, compressing down into itself until it was just a point in the distance, and then it was gone. The road spit us out onto Highway 14, right where we'd exited, like we'd driven a complete loop. According to the car's clock, 47 seconds had passed since we'd taken the detour. 47 seconds. We'd been in that town for over an hour, but the outside world had barely moved. Traffic was in the same position, the same RV was in front of us. The sun was at the same angle. My wife pulled up the GPS history on her phone, and there was no record of the detour. No record of any route except straight along Highway 14. No towns, no roads, nothing. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. That night, I went through every map I could find online, satellite views, historical records, looking for any mention of a town in that area. Nothing. The land between Beacon Rock and where we lived is national forest, protected land. No settlements permitted. But I found something else. Missing persons reports. Dozens of them spread across decades, all from the Columbia River Gorge area. People who went for drives and never came back. Families who took the scenic route and vanished. Hikers who left the main trail and were never seen again. The reports go back over 100 years, and they never stop. My daughter started having nightmares about people in old clothes standing around her bed, just watching. My son stopped talking for 3 days after we got home. My wife made me promise we'd never go back to the gorge, never take any detours, stick to major highways from now on. I agreed. But I can't stop thinking about those people in the church, staring at nothing, waiting for something. And I can't stop thinking about what the old man said. Nobody leaves until the bell rings. We heard it ring 3 times. How many times does it ring in total? And what happens to the people who are still there when it stops? I was 3 weeks into my graduate research on volcanic formations when I found the cave that shouldn't exist. Mount St. Helens had blown itself apart in 1980, reshaped the entire landscape, and 45 years later, the blast zone is still this alien moonscape of gray pumice and struggling vegetation. I was there studying the way lava tubes form during pyroclastic flows, collecting samples, mapping underground structures that developed during the eruption. It was solo work. Just me and my equipment hiking through terrain that most people avoid because it still feels dead, still feels wrong even after all these years. I liked the solitude. It gave me space to think, to focus on the science without distractions. That was before I understood that some places should stay unexplored. The cave entrance wasn't on any of my geological surveys. I found it by accident when I slipped on loose scoria and slid about 15 feet down an embankment I'd been trying to avoid. I landed hard, knocked the wind out of myself, and while I was lying there trying to breathe, I saw the opening. It was maybe 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, a dark mouth in the gray rock about 20 yards from where I'd fallen. What caught my attention was the air coming out of it. Not wind, not a breeze, but rhythmic pulses of warm air, like the cave was exhaling. I timed it while I caught my breath. 7 seconds of warm air flowing out, 3 seconds of still air, then a subtle pull inward for 2 seconds. Then the cycle repeated. I should have marked it on my GPS and come back with proper equipment, with colleagues, with safety protocols. But I was curious, and I was alone, and I had my headlamp and sampling gear. So I convinced myself a quick preliminary investigation would be fine. The entrance was tight but passable. I crawled in on my hands and knees, feeling that warm exhalation wash over me. And after about 10 feet, the passage opened up enough that I could stand. My headlamp beam showed a tunnel leading deeper into the mountain, walls smooth in a way that lava tubes aren't supposed to be. Lava tubes are rough, jagged, formed by molten rock that leaves sharp surfaces when it drains away. This was smooth, almost polished. And it was warm, noticeably warmer than the outside air, with that same rhythmic pulse I'd felt at the entrance. I followed it in, documenting everything with my camera, taking measurements, trying to make sense of the formation. The tunnel curved gently downward, and the walls had this strange texture when I touched them. Not quite rock, slightly yielding under pressure, like there was something soft underneath a hard outer layer. I told myself it was a mineral deposit, some kind of silicate buildup. But it felt organic. It felt wrong. The air pulses got stronger the deeper I went. Warm exhalations that smelled sweet and rotten at the same time, like decomposing flowers. About 50 yards in, the tunnel opened into a chamber. Not huge, maybe the size of a large room, but the walls were different here. They weren't gray like volcanic rock. They were darker, almost pink in places, with visible striations that ran vertically down from the ceiling to the floor. I moved my headlamp slowly across the surface, and that's when I realized the walls were moving. Not dramatically, just a subtle expansion and contraction that matched the breathing rhythm I'd been feeling. The whole chamber was breathing, expanding for 7 seconds, holding for 3, contracting for 2. I stood there frozen, watching this impossible thing, my scientific mind trying to rationalize what I was seeing while every instinct screamed at me to get out. I reached out and touched the wall. It was warm, blood warm, and when I pressed my hand against it, I could feel something underneath. Something that pulsed. I jerked my hand back and looked at my palm in the headlamp beam. There was residue on my skin, clear and viscous, and where it touched me, my skin was tingling. Not painful, just a pins and needles sensation like my hand had fallen asleep. I wiped it on my pants and immediately regretted it as the tingling spread to my thigh, where the residue had transferred. That's when I noticed the smell was getting stronger. That sweet rot odor, thick enough now that I could taste it. And underneath it, something else. Something chemical and sharp that reminded me of stomach acid. I backed toward the tunnel entrance, keeping my headlamp trained on the walls, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. There were shapes in the walls, not patterns or mineral deposits. Shapes. Organic shapes pressed into the surface like they were sealed inside. I moved closer to one, my scientific curiosity overriding my fear for just a moment, and I could make out details. It was a deer, or what used to be a deer. Partially dissolved, partially absorbed into the wall tissue, its skull visible through translucent membrane, empty eye sockets staring at nothing. I swept my light around the chamber and saw more. Dozens more. small animals mostly, rodents and birds, but also larger shapes I couldn't identify. All of them in various stages of being absorbed, some almost completely dissolved, others still recognizable. And in the center of the chamber, on the floor, there was a depression. A shallow bowl shape, maybe 10 feet across, and the surface was wet, glistening in my headlamp beam. The breathing cycle hit its exhale phase, and I watched that liquid ripple and bubble, watched vapor rise from its surface. It was a digestive pool. I was standing inside something that was digesting prey. The chamber contracted, that 2-second inhale phase, and I felt the air pressure change. Felt it pull at me, gentle but insistent, trying to draw me toward the center pool. I turned and ran for the tunnel, scrambling through the opening, my hands slipping on the walls that were slick with that clear residue. Behind me, I could hear something changing. The breathing rhythm accelerating, becoming ragged and harsh. The tunnel was contracting, the walls closing in, and I realized with absolute terror that whatever this thing was, it knew I was trying to escape. I crawled as fast as I could, scraping my knees and elbows on the narrowing passage, and the warm air blasting past me was no longer rhythmic. It was constant now, hot and fetid, and I could hear sounds that weren't geological, sounds that were organic, wet sliding sounds like muscle moving under skin. The tunnel was getting tighter, the walls pressing in from all sides, and I genuinely thought I was going to be trapped, going to be slowly dissolved like those animals in the chamber. My backpack got stuck, and I had to abandon it, wriggling forward with just my body and my headlamp, my chest compressed so tight I could barely breathe. I saw daylight, that gray volcanic daylight that never looked so beautiful. I pushed forward with everything I had, felt the tunnel squeeze around me one final time, and then I was out, tumbling down the embankment in a shower of loose rock, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. I scrambled away from the cave entrance, expecting to see it still there, still breathing. But when I looked back, there was nothing. Just blank rock face, gray pumice, and scattered boulders. No opening at all. I climbed back up to where I'd fallen, searched the entire area, and found nothing. The cave was gone like it had never existed. But my backpack was gone too. My sampling equipment, my notes, my camera with all the photos I'd taken. All of it still inside whatever that thing was. And my hands and my thigh, where that residue had touched me, the tingling was getting worse. Spreading. I hiked back to my base camp as fast as I could and scrubbed my skin raw with soap and cold water from my supply cans. The tingling faded after about 2 hours, leaving behind red patches that looked almost like chemical burns. I didn't tell anyone. I packed up my camp 3 days early and left the blast zone. I told my advisor the research wasn't going as planned, that I needed to revise my approach. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I started researching, looking for any similar reports, any documented cases of biological caves or organisms that could grow that large. I found nothing. Nothing in scientific literature, nothing in geology databases, nothing that explained what I'd encountered. What I did find were the disappearance reports. People who'd gone into the Mount St. Helens blast zone and never came out. Hikers, researchers, photographers. 17 documented cases over the past 40 years, and probably more that were never reported because the area was restricted for so long after the eruption. I looked at the locations where they were last seen, plotted them on a map, and they formed a rough circle around the area where I'd found the cave. Or where the cave had found me. I went back 1 month later. I had to know if it was real, if I'd actually experienced what I thought I'd experienced. I brought a colleague, told her I wanted to collect additional samples from a promising formation. We hiked to the exact coordinates where I'd fallen, where the cave had been. Nothing. Just solid rock. We spent 6 hours searching the area and found no caves, no openings, nothing unusual. My colleague thought I'd gotten the GPS coordinates wrong. But that night, back at our camp, I woke up at 2 a.m. and felt it. That rhythmic pulse of warm air coming from somewhere in the darkness. 7 seconds out, 3 seconds still, 2 seconds in. I could hear it now too, a wet sound like lungs filling and emptying. I packed my tent in the dark and left. Told my colleague I had a family emergency and needed to go immediately. I haven't been back to Mount St. Helens. I won't go back. Because I understand now what I found down there. The eruption didn't kill everything in its path. It woke something up, something that had been dormant under the mountain, sealed away by rock and pressure, and when the mountain exploded, it was exposed. And now it's healing, growing, adapting to its new environment. The cave isn't a cave. It's an organ, part of something much larger that's still mostly buried under millions of tons of volcanic debris. Sometimes I dream about those shapes in the walls, about that deer's skull staring through translucent membrane. And I wake up holding my breath, counting 7 seconds, then 3, then 2, feeling that same rhythm in my own chest. The tingling comes back sometimes, in my hands and my thigh, always at night, always when I'm alone. And I wonder if some of that residue is still in my skin, breaking down my cells molecule by molecule, slowly incorporating me into whatever that thing is. I wonder if I'm being digested remotely, if I'll wake up one morning and find myself transparent like those animals in the wall, still conscious but unable to move, feeling myself dissolve from the inside out. The blast zone is still restricted in many areas. The Forest Service says it's for environmental protection, to let the ecosystem recover naturally. But I think they know. I think they've known for years that something in that gray wasteland isn't geological. They just don't know what to do about it. How do you kill something that's the size of a mountain? How do you even begin to fight something that's been alive since before humans existed, that survived a volcanic eruption that destroyed everything else for miles? You can't. You just establish restricted zones and hope it stays dormant, hope it stays satisfied with deer and rodents and the occasional hiker who ignores the warning signs. But it's growing. I know it is. Every year the restricted zones expand a little further. Every year there are more disappearances. And every night I lie awake, counting breaths. 7 out, 3 still, 2 in. And I know that somewhere under Mount St. Helens, in the darkness beneath all that gray volcanic rock, something is breathing with me. They found them on the 3rd day, all 6 of them, huddled together in a clearing about 2 miles from where they'd last been seen. And that's when the real nightmare started. I was part of the volunteer search and rescue team. Had been doing SAR work for about 8 years at that point, mostly day hikers who'd gotten lost or twisted an ankle, the occasional overnight search for someone who'd wandered off trail. Standard stuff. But this search was different from the moment we got the call. The missing group was experienced. 3 couples in their 30s, all of them regular hikers, all of them carrying proper gear and emergency supplies. They'd gone into the Olympic Peninsula for a 3-day backpacking trip, filed their route plan with the ranger station like they were supposed to. And when they didn't check out on schedule, the rangers waited the standard 12 hours before calling it in. We mobilized fast, 40 volunteers plus park service personnel, dogs, the whole operation. The weather had been clear, no reason for them to be in trouble. But you never know. People make mistakes, accidents happen, even experienced hikers can run into problems. We divided into teams and started working the trail system they'd planned to use. Their last confirmed location was a backcountry campsite, where they'd signed the trail register 2 days earlier. From there, they should have hiked out on a well-marked loop trail, about 8 miles, nothing technical. But they never made it back. The first day of searching turned up nothing. No signs, no tracks, no equipment. It was like they'd just evaporated. The second day we expanded the search area, brought in helicopters, checked every side trail and drainage. Still nothing. I was starting to think we were looking at a recovery operation, that something catastrophic had happened. Then on the morning of the third day, one of the dog teams hit on something. The dogs went crazy, pulling their handlers toward a section of forest that was well off any established trail, dense old growth that would be hell to navigate through. We followed them in, machetes out to clear the undergrowth. And that's when we found the clearing. It wasn't natural. You could tell someone or something had cleared the brush away. And in the center of it were the 6 missing hikers. They were alive, sitting on the ground with their backs to each other in a tight circle. And every single one of them was staring straight ahead with the kind of focus that makes your skin crawl. I called out to them, identified myself as search and rescue, and none of them reacted. Not a blink, not a turn of the head, nothing. We approached carefully, checking for injuries, for hypothermia, for any obvious medical emergency. They were physically fine. No wounds, no signs of trauma. Their gear was scattered around them, and they were dressed appropriately for the conditions. But they wouldn't respond to questions, wouldn't acknowledge our presence at all. Their eyes were open and tracking, following something we couldn't see, moving in perfect synchronization. When one person's eyes moved left, all 6 pairs of eyes moved left. When one looked up, they all looked up. My team leader tried everything. Loud voices, gentle voices, physical contact, shining lights in their eyes. Nothing worked. They just kept staring, kept tracking whatever invisible thing they were watching, and their breathing was synchronized too. 6 people breathing in perfect unison, chests rising and falling at exactly the same rate. One of the paramedics checked vitals and found everything normal. Heart rates were elevated but steady, blood pressure was fine, pupils were reactive. They were conscious and aware, just completely unresponsive. We decided to evacuate them, get them to a hospital where they could be properly evaluated. It took 8 of us to move them because they wouldn't help, wouldn't stand, wouldn't walk. We had to physically lift each one and carry them to the litters we'd brought in. The moment we separated them, breaking that circle they'd formed, they started making sounds. Not words, not screaming. Just this low, keening noise that came from all 6 of them at once. Same pitch, same rhythm, like they were all parts of the same instrument. The sound made my teeth hurt, made my bones feel wrong, and I wanted to put them back in their circle just to make it stop. We got them out of the forest and into ambulances, transported them to the nearest hospital where a team of doctors took over. I stayed to give my report, describe exactly how we'd found them, and while I was talking to the incident commander, one of the nurses came running out. She said we needed to come see something. We followed her to the observation room where they'd put the 6 hikers, and what I saw made absolutely no sense. They'd been placed in separate beds, sedated, hooked up to monitors, but their vital signs were synchronized. Heart rates matching beat for beat, respiratory rates identical, even their brain waves on the EEG machines were showing the same patterns. 6 separate people displaying identical physiological responses. The doctors couldn't explain it. They ran every test they could think of. Toxicology came back clean. No drugs, no toxins, no pathogens. Brain scans showed normal structure, no damage, no anomalies. But the 6 of them stayed locked in that synchronized state for 3 days. On the 4th day, one of them spoke. A woman, mid-30s. She opened her mouth and said very clearly, "It showed us." The doctors rushed over, asked her what she meant, asked her to elaborate. She turned her head, looked directly at the doctor, and her eyes weren't right. The focus was wrong, like she was looking through him rather than at him. She said it again, "It showed us." And then all 6 of them said it together. Perfect unison, same inflection, same tone. "It showed us." That was all they would say. For 2 weeks, anytime someone asked them a question, tried to engage them in any way, they would respond with that same phrase. "It showed us." Their families came, tried to reach them, tried to break through whatever had happened to them in those woods. Nothing worked. They ate when food was put in front of them, used the bathroom when directed, followed basic instructions, but they never broke that synchronization. They moved through the hospital like they were one organism in 6 bodies. Then on day 16, they all stood up at exactly 3 in the morning. The night staff heard them moving and went to check, found all 6 of them standing by the windows of their rooms, staring out toward the Olympic Mountains. The mountains weren't visible from the hospital, wrong direction, but they were all staring at the exact same point in space. One of the nurses tried to guide them back to bed, and the woman, the same one who'd spoken before, turned and looked at her and said, "We have to go back. It's not finished showing us." The hospital tried to keep them under observation, but they weren't prisoners. They weren't mentally incompetent. They were just strange. Their families eventually took them home, trying to resume normal life, trying to get them help. But it didn't matter where they went, what doctors they saw, what medications they tried. The 6 of them remained synchronized, and they all pointed in the same direction whenever anyone asked them where it happened. Toward the Olympics, toward that clearing where we'd found them. I went back to that clearing 3 months later. I shouldn't have. I was off duty. I had no reason to be there. But I needed to see it again. I needed to understand what had happened to those people. The clearing was still there, still obviously man-made or something made. But now there were marks on the trees surrounding it. Scratches, deep gouges in the bark, forming patterns I couldn't recognize. And in the center of the clearing, where the 6 hikers had been sitting, the ground was different. The vegetation was dead, brown and withered in a perfect circle, and the soil itself looked scorched, even though there was no evidence of fire. I took photographs, collected samples, tried to document everything scientifically. But standing there, in that clearing, I felt something I'd never felt in all my years of SR work. I felt watched, not by a person, not by an animal, by something else. Something that was aware of me, studying me, deciding what to do with me. I stayed for maybe 10 minutes before my nerve broke, and I hiked out faster than I'd ever moved through terrain like that. I didn't run, but I wanted to. Behind me, I could hear something in the forest. Not footsteps, just movement. Just the sound of branches bending and undergrowth rustling, keeping pace with me. Staying just out of sight, I made it back to my vehicle and drove home. That night, I dreamed about the clearing. I was sitting there with the 6 hikers, forming a 7th point on their circle, and we were all staring at something in the trees, something huge, something that didn't fit properly into three-dimensional space, something that was showing us things we weren't meant to comprehend. I woke up screaming, my wife shaking me, asking what was wrong. I couldn't tell her. I still can't tell anyone what I saw in that dream because the memory won't come into focus. It's like trying to remember something from before you were born. The 6 hikers are still synchronized. I check on them sometimes through their families, through mutual contacts. They live separate lives now, went back to their jobs, their homes. But they're still connected. They call each other at exactly the same moment. They wake up at exactly the same time. They still point toward the Olympics when asked about the clearing. And once a year, on the anniversary of when we found them, they all drive to the nearest trailhead, park their cars, and stare into the forest for exactly 4 hours before going home. They don't hike in. They just stand there and watch, their eyes tracking something the rest of us can't see. I quit SAR work 6 months after that search. Told everyone I was getting too old for it, that my knees couldn't handle the terrain anymore. But the truth is, I couldn't go back into those woods. I couldn't risk finding another group like that, or worse, becoming one of them. Because sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring toward the Olympics, my eyes tracking movement I can't consciously see, my breathing falling into a rhythm that isn't quite my own. And I wonder if that thing in the clearing, whatever it was, decided it wasn't finished showing me either. I wonder if I'm slowly joining that group, if eventually I'll wake up one morning and drive to that trailhead and stand there for 4 hours staring at nothing. Or staring at something the rest of the world just can't perceive yet. The worst part is, I'm starting to want to. There's this pull, this curiosity that grows stronger every day. What did it show them? What are they still seeing? What would I understand if I just went back to that clearing and sat down and opened myself up to whatever's waiting there? I fight it. Every day I fight it. But I don't know how long I can keep fighting. Because sometimes, when I'm alone, when it's quiet, I can almost see it. Almost understand what those 6 people understood. And part of me, the part that's already been touched by whatever's in those woods, desperately wants to see the rest. I found the homestead completely by accident, and I wish to God I'd kept walking. Metal detecting is supposed to be relaxing, a way to spend weekends hunting for old coins and lost jewelry, maybe the occasional historical artifact if you get lucky. I'd been working a stretch of eastern Washington forest, where there were records of 1880s settlement activity, long before it became state land. The families who'd tried to make a life out here were gone by 1920, driven out by failed crops and brutal winters, leaving nothing but foundations and trash piles for people like me to pick through. I'd found some square nails, a few broken bottles. Nothing valuable but interesting enough to keep me searching. That's when my detector went off strong near what looked like a natural depression in the ground. I cleared away the pine needles and found rotted boards underneath, part of a structure that had collapsed inward, a root cellar built into the hillside the way settlers used to do, keeping food cool in summer and preventing it from freezing in winter. The boards were too far gone to support any weight, so I widened the hole carefully, using my folding shovel to move dirt until I had an opening big enough to look through. My flashlight beam showed stone walls below, maybe 8 feet deep, and a dirt floor. There was something down there, shapes I couldn't quite make out. And that curiosity that's gotten me in trouble my whole life took over. I rigged a rope to a tree and lowered myself down. The air was cold and perfectly still. No movement, no circulation, like the space had been sealed for 100 years. which it probably had been. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with careful stone masonry on all four walls. Someone had put real work into building this, had planned to use it for years. But what caught my attention were the shelves along the far wall, and what was on them. Jars. Mason jars, the old kind with the glass lids and wire bales, and they were full. Not food, not preserves. The contents were pale and organic-looking, suspended in fluid that had gone cloudy with age. I moved closer, my flashlight beam playing across the glass, and my stomach dropped when I realized what I was looking at. Tissue. Human tissue. The jars were carefully labeled in faded ink, names and dates written in old-fashioned script. Margaret, age 3, taken December 1889. Thomas, age 7, taken March 1891. Elizabeth, age 5, taken January 1892. There were 19 jars total. I counted them twice to be sure. And every single one contained what looked like organs or flesh samples, and every label indicated a child under the age of 10. The dates spanned from 1886 to 1898, 12 years of collection. I should have left immediately, should have climbed out and called the authorities and let them handle it. But I needed to understand what I was seeing, needed context for this horror. I started photographing everything with my phone, documenting the jars, the labels, the condition of the cellar. That's when I noticed the book. It was sitting on one of the lower shelves, leather-bound and water-damaged, but intact. I picked it up carefully and opened it to the first page. It was a journal, written in the same hand as the jar labels, and the first entry was dated April 1886. The entries were clinical, methodical. The writer, who never gave their name, described a process they called preservation of essence. They believed that children contained something pure that could be captured and stored, something they called the sleeping seed that resided in specific organs. Heart tissue for courage, liver for health, kidney for endurance. They'd been experimenting on their own children first, the journal said, trying to perfect the technique before expanding to other families in the settlement. The entries described surgeries performed in this root cellar, children held down on a wooden table, procedures done without anesthetic because they believed the pain was necessary to activate the seed. I wanted to stop reading, but I couldn't. The journal went on for pages, describing failure after failure. Children who died during the procedures, whose tissue proved inert and useless. The writer became convinced that the children needed to be preserved while still alive, that killing them destroyed the essence they were trying to capture. So they developed a new technique. They would put the children into a state they called hibernation, using a mixture of herbs and minerals to slow their vital signs to near-death levels, and then seal them into the root cellar where the cool temperature would keep them suspended indefinitely. The final entry was dated January 1899. It said, "The last of the children are prepared. 7 sleepers now rest beneath the floor, waiting for the day when their essence can be properly extracted. The town believes they ran away or were taken by wolves. No one suspects. The work will continue when I return from the East, where I go to study with others who understand." There was no entry after that. Whoever had written this had left and never come back, leaving 7 children buried under this root cellar floor for over a century. I looked down at the dirt floor I was standing on. It was packed hard, undisturbed. But now that I was looking for it, I could see depressions. 7 slight depressions in the floor, roughly child-sized, arranged in a pattern. My hands started shaking. The journal said they'd been put into hibernation, not killed. But that was impossible. You can't suspend human life for 100 years. Whatever had been buried here was long dead. Just Bones now. Nothing to be afraid of. I told myself that over and over while I stood there in the dark, with my flashlight showing me those 7 depressions in the ground. That's when I felt it. A vibration coming up through my boots. Subtle, rhythmic, like something breathing underneath the dirt. I stepped back quickly, and the vibration stopped. I moved to a different spot and felt it again, coming from a different location now. I swept my flashlight across the floor, and one of the depressions looked different. The dirt had cracked, just slightly, spiderweb fractures radiating out from the center. As I watched, the crack widened. Something under the ground was moving. I ran for the rope, grabbed it with both hands, and started climbing. Below me, I heard sounds, dirt shifting, something pushing upward. I climbed faster, my shoulders screaming, rope burning my palms, and I was halfway up when I heard the first break through. Dirt cascading down, something emerging into the cellar. I didn't look back. I pulled myself up and over the edge of the hole, and I ran. Behind me, I could hear more sounds, more breaking earth, and something else. Breathing. Multiple sources, ragged and wet, like lungs that hadn't drawn air in a century. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck a quarter mile away. I threw my gear in the back and drove, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. Showed them the photos on my phone, the journal entries, the coordinates of the homestead. They sent a team out there the next day with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. I stayed home. I couldn't go back there. The sheriff called me 3 days later and asked me to come in. He sat me down in his office and showed me the official report. They'd found the Root Cellar exactly where I'd said it was. The stone walls were intact, the structure sound. But there were no jars, no journal, no shelves. Just an empty cellar with undisturbed dirt floor. They'd used the ground radar and found no bodies, no disturbances in the soil beneath the floor. They'd excavated anyway, dug down 6 feet in multiple locations. Nothing. The homestead records showed a family had lived there, but they'd all left together in 1899, moved back east. No missing children, no mysterious disappearances, no indication of anything wrong. I showed them the photos on my phone. The images showed the cellar, the stone walls, but the shelves were empty. No jars visible. The photos of the journal pages were blank and just blurry shots of nothing. Every piece of evidence I'd collected had somehow changed or disappeared. The sheriff was professional about it. Said sometimes isolated places play tricks on the mind. Said the forest can make people see things that aren't there. He suggested I take a break from solo detecting trips, maybe bring a friend next time. But I know what I saw. I know what I read in that journal. And I know what I heard breaking through the dirt floor as I climbed out of that cellar. 3 weeks later, I started seeing the news reports. Children going missing in eastern Washington. Small towns spread across a 100-mile radius. 6 kids in 3 weeks, all under age 10, all vanished from their homes in the middle of the night. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. The parents all reported the same thing. Their child's room smelled like damp earth and old stone, and there were small, dirty footprints leading from the child's bed to the window. I drove back to the homestead site last week. I had to know if the cellar was still there, if those depressions in the floor were still empty. The sheriff's excavation had been filled in, covered over, marked with a "Do Not Disturb" archaeological site sign. But there were new tracks in the area. Small ones, barefoot, pressed deep into the soft ground like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. The tracks led away from the cellar site in 7 different directions, spreading out into the forest. and I followed one set for about 50 yards before I found what they'd been carrying. A backpack, small, child-sized, pink with cartoon characters. One of the missing kids had been carrying one just like it in her last known photo. I picked it up and it was empty except for dirt in the bottom. Fresh dirt, damp and cold, the kind you'd find deep underground. I dropped it and ran back to my truck, and as I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw them. 7 small figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. Their clothes were rotted tatters, their skin was pale as paper, and even from that distance, I could see that their eyes were open way too wide. Like they'd been staring into darkness for so long they couldn't remember how to blink. The missing children haven't been found. The investigation is ongoing. But there are no leads, no suspects, no evidence. I haven't told anyone what I saw at the homestead. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself. But I know those 7 children who were buried in that root cellar didn't stay dead. I know that whatever procedure was done to them worked, kept them in some kind of suspended state for over 100 years. And when I broke open that cellar and let fresh air in, I woke them up. And now they're doing what children do. They're playing, they're exploring, and they're collecting friends to take back to the dark place where they've been sleeping. Because even children who've been dead for a century remember what it's like to be lonely. I've been a nurse for 11 years, working night shift at a regional hospital in Port Angeles, which means I've driven Highway 101 through the Hoh rainforest more times than I can count. 3 nights a week, I make the drive home around 3:30 in the morning when the road is completely empty and the darkness is so thick it feels like you're driving through ink. You get used to it after a while, the way your headlights barely penetrate the fog that rolls in off the Pacific. The way the massive Sitka spruces crowd right up to the shoulder, their branches hanging over the pavement like they're reaching for your car. The way you'll sometimes see elk or black-tailed deer standing at the road's edge, their eyes reflecting your headlights in that unsettling way that makes you slow down and hold your breath until they move. I thought I'd seen everything these woods could throw at me. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday in late October, around 3 in the morning, and I was maybe 20 minutes from home. The road through the Hoh is narrow and winding, no center line in most places, and you have to stay alert because there are no lights, no houses, nothing but forest pressing in from both sides. I'd had a long shift, a bad shift actually, lost a patient we'd been fighting to save for 3 days. And I was tired in that bone-deep way where you can feel exhaustion in your teeth. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, showing me maybe 50 feet of wet pavement and nothing else. The wipers were going because there's always moisture in the air near the rainforest. Not quite rain, but heavy enough that your windshield gets coated if you're not careful. I came around a long curve doing maybe 45 miles per hour, being cautious like you have to be on this stretch. And that's when I saw it start to cross. At first I thought it was a fallen tree that had slid down the embankment onto the road, which happens sometimes during storms. But it was moving, flowing across the pavement from the uphill side to the downhill side in a continuous motion. And I realized I was seeing something massive crossing the road in segments. I hit the brakes instinctively, not hard enough to skid, but enough to slow down fast. And I just watched. My headlights were pointed directly at it, illuminating maybe a 20-foot section of pavement. And something was passing through that circle of light in sections that didn't make sense together. The first part I saw was covered in dark fur, coarse and thick like bear fur, but the wrong texture somehow, too oily, moving wrong under whatever skin was underneath. It was maybe 6 feet tall as it crossed, cylindrical, and it took about 8 seconds to pass completely through my headlight beam from left to right. Then there was a gap of about 3 seconds where I just stared at empty pavement. Then the next section came through. This part was different. No fur. Instead, it was covered in something that looked like scales, dark and overlapping, catching my headlights and reflecting them back with an oily sheen. This section was thicker than the first, maybe 8 feet in diameter, and it was lower to the ground, moving with a sliding motion that reminded me of a snake. I sat there with my foot on the brake, both hands gripping the wheel, unable to process what I was seeing. Another gap, maybe 2 seconds this time, and the next section appeared. This one was wet. Not wet like rain. Wet like something that had just emerged from deep water or something that was naturally covered in moisture. It gleamed under my headlights, and I could see it was pale, almost translucent, and underneath the surface I could see structures moving. Things that might have been muscles or organs or something else entirely, pulsing and sliding under that thin membrane. This section was smaller, maybe 4 feet across, and it left a trail of liquid on the pavement that steamed in the cold air. I started counting the sections as they passed, not because I was thinking clearly, but because my brain needed something to hold on to, some framework to understand what was happening. 6 sections, 7, 8, each one different from the last. One was covered in what looked like moth wings, thousands of them overlapping and fluttering slightly as it moved, even though there was no wind. One was smooth and dark like volcanic glass, so black that my headlights seemed to be absorbed by it rather than reflected. One was articulated, jointed like an insect's body, with protrusions that might have been legs folded tight against its sides. I checked the dashboard clock when it started. 3:07. I watched sections continue to pass, each one impossible, each one violating everything I understood about biology and physics. The segments kept coming, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't see either end. Not the beginning where it was coming from, not the end where it was going. It was just crossing, endlessly, and my headlights only showed me this small window of its total length. 12 sections. 15, 20. Some of them repeated, or at least I thought they did. I saw fur again, but a different texture. I saw scales again, but a different pattern. Or maybe my brain was just failing to catalog the differences because there were too many to process. I thought about putting the car in reverse, backing up and turning around, driving back the way I'd come. But I couldn't take my eyes off the road ahead, couldn't look away from what was crossing. And some part of me knew that if I looked in the rearview mirror, I might see something worse. I might see more of it, stretching back down the road I'd already traveled, meaning I'd driven past it without knowing, meaning it was even longer than I could comprehend. So I sat there and I watched and I counted. 28 sections. 30, 35. My hands were cramping from gripping the wheel, and I forced myself to relax them, to take a breath. The air in the car felt wrong, too thick, too warm, and I realized the temperature gauge was climbing. The engine was running hot, even though I wasn't moving, wasn't putting any strain on it. I looked at the clock again. 3:08. Only 1 minute had passed, but it felt like I'd been sitting there for 10 minutes, watching this thing cross. Time was moving wrong, or my perception was off, or both. 40 sections. 42. I started to pray, not because I'm particularly religious, but because I needed words to fill my head. Needed something other than the image of those segments passing through my headlight beam. Some sections made sounds as they crossed, not loud sounds, but I could hear them through the closed windows, wet, sliding sounds, chittering sounds like insects, something that might have been breathing, deep and labored, a high-pitched hum that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. 47. And then it stopped. The final section passed through my headlights, and there was empty pavement again, wet and steaming where the thing had crossed. I looked at the clock. 3:08. Still 3:08. Either the clock had stopped or those 47 seconds of segments passing had somehow fit into the space of 1 minute, and I didn't know which option was worse. I sat there for another 30 seconds, watching the empty road, waiting to see if more would come. Nothing did. The road was clear. The forest was silent. Everything looked normal except for the wet trail crossing the pavement from left to right, already starting to evaporate in the cold air. I put the car in drive and moved forward slowly, so slowly that I was barely rolling. My headlights showed me the trail clearly now. It was about 3 feet wide, darker than water, and it reflected my headlights with rainbow patterns like oil but thicker, more viscous. I stopped just before I reached it, unable to make myself drive over it, unable to make myself touch any part of whatever that thing had left behind. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, just staring at the trail before I realized I couldn't stay here all night. I had to either go forward or go back. I went forward, drove across that trail, and felt my tires grip something that wasn't quite liquid, something that resisted briefly before letting me pass. The steering felt wrong for a second, like the car wanted to follow the direction of the trail instead of continuing straight. Then I was across and the handling normalized, and I accelerated, faster than I should have on this road, pushing 50, then 55, just needing to put distance between myself and that crossing point. I made it home in 15 minutes, parked in my driveway, and sat in the car with the engine running and all the doors locked. I was shaking. I couldn't stop shaking. I pulled out my phone and thought about calling someone. But who? What would I say? I'd sound insane. I'd sound like I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. Except I hadn't. I knew I hadn't because when I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, I could see my knuckles were white, bloodless from gripping too hard, because my shirt was soaked with sweat, because the timestamp on my dash cam, which I'd forgotten was recording, showed a gap. The video went from 3:06 to 3:08 with nothing in between. 47 seconds of missing footage. Exactly the time I'd been watching that thing cross. I went inside and I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with all the lights on and I tried to sketch what I'd seen, tried to draw the different sections, but my hands were shaking too badly. I ended up with just scribbles and notes. Fur, scales, wet membrane, wings, glass black, jointed. Words that meant nothing, that couldn't capture what I'd witnessed. When daylight finally came, I felt better, the way you do when the sun rises and the world normalizes. I convinced myself that I'd been tired, that I'd hallucinated, that there was some rational explanation. But I couldn't make myself drive to work that night. I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't make myself get in my car and drive that road in the darkness. I asked my supervisor if I could switch to day shift. She said there were no openings, but she'd put me on the list. That was 6 weeks ago. I've been driving the long way to work, adding an extra 40 minutes to my commute. Taking Highway 112 along the coast, even though it's slower and the road quality is worse. I've been avoiding Highway 101 through the Hoe entirely. Last week, one of my coworkers mentioned that they'd seen something weird on their drive home. Something crossing the road near milepost 178, which is exactly where I had my encounter. They said they couldn't really describe it, that it was too dark and it happened too fast. But it seemed really big, and it took a long time to cross. I asked them how long. They checked their dashcam timestamp. 47 seconds of missing footage. I didn't tell them about my experience. I just nodded and changed the subject. But I've been thinking about it constantly. About what that thing was, where it came from, where it was going. The Hoh rainforest is one of the last truly wild places in the lower 48. Thousands of acres of old-growth forest that has never been logged, never been developed. The trees are hundreds of years old, some of them thousands. The forest floor is so thick with moss and ferns that you can't see the ground. There are places in there that humans have never been, valleys and ravines that have never seen a human footstep. What lives in those places? What grows to impossible size in that ancient darkness? I've been researching missing persons in the Olympic Peninsula, and there are more than you'd think. Hikers who never came back. Hunters who vanished. People whose cars were found abandoned on forest roads with no trace of the driver. The official explanations are always the same. They got lost, they fell, they succumbed to hypothermia, they were taken by animals. But what if some of them saw what I saw? What if they followed it into the forest, trying to understand, trying to find where it came from or where it was going? What if they got too close and it noticed them? I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what I saw. I need there to be a record in case something happens to me. Because I've decided I have to go back. I have to know what it was. I've requested a leave of absence from work, told them it's for personal reasons. I've bought camping equipment, trail cameras, recording devices. I'm going to hike into the forest at the point where that thing crossed the road. I'm going to follow the direction it was moving, and I'm going to find where it came from or where it went. I know this is probably the last thing I'll ever write. I know I should leave it alone, should be grateful I survived the encounter and never go back. But I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop seeing those segments passing through my headlights. 47 seconds that somehow fit into 1 minute. 47 pieces of something so large and so impossible that my mind still can't hold the full image of it. If you're reading this and I haven't come back, don't send anyone looking for me. Don't let anyone else go into that forest. Whatever crosses the road on Highway 101 near milepost 178, whatever it is, it's been there longer than we have. It's older than the road, older than the towns, maybe older than the trees themselves. And it's not done moving. I think it's just beginning.